right, so let's see. Everybody weigh in? Oh, thank you. All right, now I got 51% true, 49, oh, 53% true. Get everybody to weigh in. I'm getting ready to end it. About 5 seconds and I'll end it. All right, poll is ending. Statute of Frauds says certain real estate documents must be recorded to be enforceable. True or false? Let me emphasize that word again. Certain documents must be recorded to be enforceable. Statute of Frauds has nothing to do with recording, does it? Statute of Frauds says it has to be in writing and signed to be enforceable. So the answer we were looking for is false, and you're absolutely right. Recorded is the Connor Act. See how one word can change everything? Statute of Frauds and Connor Act are very oftentimes mixed up because one word changes everything. Now, a lot of times, Statute of Frauds and Connor Act run hand in hand. So what the Statute of Frauds says, Connor agrees to, vice versa. But we still need to understand, that there's a difference. So let's make sure we're good. The Connor Act is the act that says that there are certain documents that we have to record. And why do we record them? So that they're enforceable, to protect the owner against third parties. So remember in Unit 5, we talked about the deed and we talked about title. And we said title is the idea, deed is the documentary evidence. Once you have that tangible piece of paper, the deed, that's what you take to the courthouse to let the world know you are the owner of record. You own this property. So Connor Act was Unit 5 about recording. Statute of Frauds is Unit 9. Statute of Frauds says it has to be in writing and signed. Why? So it's enforceable. Remember, we talked about in Unit 9 the validity of contracts. If you take a handshake agreement to the judge, what do you have? Not much, do you? The judge is going to determine unenforceable because you don't have anything. So Statute of Frauds steps in and says, okay, there's certain documents that have to be in writing and signed. Why? So they are enforceable. So Statute of Frauds is about writing, Connor is about recorded. Do I have any questions on that? Yes. Okay, that was a good one. So let's go to Unit 10. We are working our way and we're getting ready to spend some time. Maybe. Here we go. We're getting ready to spend some time on our standard offer to purchase and contract. But we're talking about a few things that lead up to it until then. And this is the slide that we left off on Thursday. So I love actually that we ended with this conversation on Thursday and we're starting with this conversation today, because this is very, very important. And we're going to talk more about communication and how we can communicate and what happens to communication when you bring the agents in. So we're getting ready to talk a little bit more about this, but here's the big picture. No matter if you have an agent involved or not, basic contract law says you have to have two things. There are these two things that happen. There's this magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract. And in order to have a contract, we have to have these two things. Do you guys think this is important in real life? Do you think it's important in real life to know when you have a contract in your hand versus an offer? I see lots of heads going, yes, Julie, come on. You're good, shaking your head, yes. What about in this crazy market, multiple offers? There are cases, yeah, my team had a listing a couple weeks ago. We had 45 offers. Take a second to let that sink in. 45 offers. How many on one house? Yes, on one listing, 45 offers. How many of those offers can become a contract? Just one. Was there a definite moment in time when one of those 45 went under contract? The other 44 then were rejected. They moved on. So this is one of these things. Yes, it's important for your test, blah, blah, blah. But guess what? In the real world, this is even more important because there is some uncertainty out there about when it goes from being an offer to a contract. I think we're all good. If you have verbal acceptance, what do you have? Absolutely nothing. If you have verbal, you got nothing. So when you get in the real world, once you get to this point where you're taking an offer to a contract, you're going to want to verify. So in other words, when the other agent calls you and says, my guys have accepted, in the real world, your knee-jerk reaction is going to be to say, but has it been signed? Okay. For your exam, now that you're still in pre-licensing world, for your exam, when you guys see that it's been accepted, I want you to know that it has been signed. Okay, so real world and then pre-licensing world. So in pre-licensing world, when you see test questions that say it's been accepted, the last offeree has accepted, know that it's been signed. Everybody good with me on that? Real world, verify it. But once again, let's remember our goals. You don't have to worry about verifying it in the real world if you never get through this, right? So we introduced, and we're going to talk more about the line today. And I'm a big fan of the line, and we're going to build on the line a little bit. So on the line separates the buyer and the seller. So on one side of the line, you have the buyer as the offeror, the seller is the offeree. The offeror is the person making the offer, the giver of the offer. The offeree is the receivee of the offer, the person receiving it. 9.8 times out of 10, the buyer's making the first offer to the seller. But there are cases where a seller makes an offer to the buyer. So I don't want you guys to see offeror, offeree and think buyer, seller. I want you to see offeror and see the giver of the offer, and the offeree is the receivee of the offer. Okay, use the words appropriately. So in this example, in this scenario, the buyer makes an offer to the seller. The seller has three choices. Let's walk through them together. What are the seller's, the offeree's three choices? They can accept it, they can reject it, or they can counter it. If they accept it, they agree to all of the terms exactly how they are. All terms exactly how they are. Zero change. If they reject it, the offer is dead on the table. Nobody's out anything. Nobody's loses. No, just everybody goes about their lives as if it never happened. If they counter it, the offeree is rejecting the original offer with a but. Usually a counter offer sounds something like, I'm good with all the terms of your offer, but the purchase price. Or I'm good with all the terms of your offer, but this, this, and this. Please hear me. A counter offer is a rejection. It's a rejection with a but. With a rejection and a counter offer, there is no going back. Once it's rejected, it's dead on the table. Once it's dead on the table, you can't revive it.
That's where I get confused.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I get confused with this part because it seems like you still have a contract and you're going to make a counter, you're countering, but does that mean that does that mean that
you don't have a contract, you have an offer? I've made you an offer and you've countered.
That's where I get confused. Okay. So
Yes.
you made an offer.
We don't have a contract until you accept and then communicate. This two things, that magic moment in time. Yep.
Okay.
And again, and this is, and thank you for that, Stephanie, because it's really important that we're using terms like offer and contract appropriately. You don't have a contract until you have signed an acceptance. Okay. Other than that, you're just playing around with an offer. So with a counter offer, with a rejection, there is no going back. Let me ask you guys this. You can do your heads one way or the other. Let's say a counter is made and the person that made the counter, the offeree, makes the counter, and then later comes back and says, no, never mind, I accept your original offer. Can they go back and accept the original offer? We say no, because it's dead on the table. A counter offer is a rejection. So you can't go back and change your mind once you've countered it. However, can you go back and present a brand new offer with those exact same terms? And the answer there is yes. So you can't go back and revive a counter offer, but you can present a brand new offer with those same terms. Guys, buyers and sellers do this a lot. We'll be negotiating the wee hours of the morning. I'm at an age now where I think wee hours is like 9, 10 o'clock at night. And so you're up negotiating. I'm all right with that. And you're up and you're negotiating and everybody's tired. And somebody, the last offeree, finally says, you know what, never mind, I'm done. I want to go to bed. I reject it. We're done. Are you sure? Yep, I'm done. We can't get together. We can't get here. So we're not going to do this. All right. Everybody have a good night. Wake up in the morning and guess who you have an emergency text from? Call me ASAP. They slept on it in the light of day. Things sometimes look a little bit different than what they do the night before. And they said, what were we thinking? We threw this offer away. We want to go back and accept it. To which we say, we can't go back. I can call the other agent or call the other party. We can present a brand new offer with those terms that you rejected at 9:30 last night. You guys with me? But we can't change our mind. A counter offer is a rejection. A rejection is a rejection. Dead on the table. Once it's dead on the table, you can't revive it. With a counter offer, the roles reverse. So in this case, the seller received an offer. The seller had 3 choices. They accepted it, they rejected it, or they countered it. In this case, they countered it. The seller responded to the buyer and said, I'm good with all the terms of your offer except this, this, and this, or but this, this, and this. Now the buyer is the offeree. The buyer has received the seller's offer. The buyer now has 3 choices, don't they? They can accept it, reject it, or counter it. If they accept it, they agree to all the terms. If they reject it, it's dead on the table. If they counter it, the roles reverse. You end a counter by the last offeree either accepting it or rejecting it. And there's no number of times you have to counter. You can counter 50 times back and forth if you want to. There is no number of times. So in our scenario, the seller is countered. They responded to the buyer and said, I'm good with all the terms except this, this, and this. The buyer said, okay, we accept. Once the buyer accepts, for your exam, we know that that means in writing, the buyer accepts, are we under contract? The buyer accepts, are we under contract? And I see head shaking no, and we're not under contract yet because I got to have 2 things. So step 1 is to accept. Step 2 is to communicate acceptance. The person that made the offer you've got to let them know that you've accepted their offer. When we communicate acceptance, communication has to cross the line. So the buyer accepts, meaning they signed for your exam, and then the buyer calls the seller and says, I've accepted your offer. When the buyer calls or emails or texts or snail mail, we'll talk about different forms of communication in just a second. Once that communication has crossed the line, once the person making the offer knows that they're under contract, then and only then do you have a contract. Up until that time, it's just an offer. So we must, hear my absolute word, we must have these 2 things to go from being an offer to a contract. So let's say you're a nighter owl than I am, and you're up at 11:30 p.m. negotiating, and you guys are going back and forth, and you're so close, And nobody wants to put this to bed because dang it, we can make this work. And you're so close. And at, I don't know, 11:50, the buyer accepts. And I don't know, maybe they run to the restroom, maybe they do something else. And then they communicate acceptance at 12:01 tomorrow. What is our effective date? Is it today or is it tomorrow? It's tomorrow, because that's when that second step happened. That's when communication of acceptance happened. Step one is to sign it. We're close, we're halfway there. Step two is for communication to cross the line. I'm getting ready to bring agents into the mix in just 1 second. Everybody good so far? We must have two things, and that magic, there is a definite magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract, and we need to know. Everybody have this written down 5 times? Your homework for this evening. Okay, this is such an important slide. Okay, so let's bring agents into the mix. When it comes to communicating acceptance, we stand in place of our client. So when it comes to communicating acceptance, communicating to me is just as good as communicating to my client. So let's walk through, now that we brought an agent into, you see how agents are on the other side of the wall with their clients? Everybody see that? We're standing in place. We're standing on the same side of the wall with our clients. So now let's walk through our scenario again. The buyer and agent are out looking at properties. The buyer walks in the front door of a property and says, oh my gosh, this is my dream house. This is the one I've been waiting for. Let's write it up. And you go, yeah, I see you guys. You're like, it's so exciting when they say that. It is so exciting. So you go home and you look up, you know, everything you got to look up, and you pull out your standard Form 2T, offer to purchase and contract that we're getting ready to look in. And you discuss with the buyer about what they want to put in the blanks. Can I tell the buyer what to offer? Can I tell the buyer what terms? Absolutely not. I can help them. I can offer my opinion. I can help them by showing them facts and whatever else. But I can't look at them and say, you're going to offer X amount, sign here. So we have communications with our buyers. We fill in the blanks on their behalf. Then we send that filled in offer to our buyers for them to sign. So the buyers, maybe e-signature, maybe we meet them and sign on the trunk of your car or whatever. But we have our buyers sign the offer, gather all our documents, and then we present our buyer's offer to the listing agent. In this scenario, I have an agent. The listing agent calls the seller and says, we have an offer. And the seller says, what are the terms? So they have, the listing agent has a conversation, go over the terms. The seller says, I'm good with this, this, and this. I don't like this and this. So the listing agent prepares a counter. Maybe we mark up the original offer. Maybe they send an email. Maybe they send a text. But the listing agent responds to the buyer's agent and says, my guys are good with everything, but this, this, and this. So we've presented it, we've wrote up the offer, we've presented the offer, and now the seller has countered. The buyer considers the counter and says, okay, I'm good with that. I accept. In pre-licensing world, we know that means what? They have signed. Okay. The buyer's agent calls their agent and says, we've accepted. Am I under contract? The buyer's agent the buyer calls their agent and says, we've accepted. Look at the line. When the buyer calls their agent, are we under contract? No, not yet. Because I need two things. Y'all getting mad. Simmer down. I need two things to happen. When the buyer, y'all look at the line. When the buyer calls their agent, did communication cross the line? So then the next thing that the buyer does, I'm sorry, the buyer's agent does, is they call the listing agent. Now are we under contract? Woo! Now we can celebrate. Communication must cross the line. And one agent communicating to the other that your party is accepted puts us under contract. Communication must cross the line. And we're getting ready to talk about how we can communicate in just 1 second. For your test, I highly suggest, you guys will have scratch paper. I highly suggest you draw out the line and you see that communication walk back and forth, because you will have a test question that's about this long, maybe not, maybe it's only that long. You will have a really long test question, and bottom line, they want to know when that offer became a contract. So I highly recommend you guys practice with the line, because you have got to see when that communication crosses the line, because then and only then are you under contract. Good, you guys are already seeing it on practice quizzes. I'm in a good mood. I just told you there's a test question for you. I just told you you're gonna have a test question on this. Woo, we're early. I better be careful, huh? What questions do I have on this? I'm going to go back for 1 second. I've got to have two things. We have to have the last offeree sign, and then communication of acceptance has to cross the line. And what this slide is saying, when it comes to communicating terms of an offer, acceptance, termination, when it comes to communication, talking to me is just as good as talking to my principal. So let me ask you guys this. This is where I left off. The buyer's agent called the listing agent, and we've already decided we're under contract. Once that communication crossed the line, the buyer's agent called the listing agent. What do you think the very next thing the listing agent should do? Yeah, don't they want to let their seller know the good news? It's not, are you sure you want this? It's, we are under contract, because that communication crossed the line. You guys with me? So what if I'm the listing agent and I get busy and I take a phone call and I can't call my seller right away and I got to do this and I got to do that. And in the meantime, my seller sends me a text and says, never mind. Sorry, we were under contract 2 hours ago when I got that email. It's so important that we communicate. What about this? What about this scenario? The buyer calls their agent and says, we've accepted. And the buyer's agent gets busy and says, well, I'll let the listing agent know in a minute. I got to do this and run some errands and do that, make some phone calls and no. And in the meantime, the seller gets another offer that's better. Can they go under contract with that other offer? Yeah, because this buyer never formed a contract because their agent didn't cross the line. I got to have that communication cross the line. Guys, I cannot stress how important communicating is. You know, I always try to conduct my business so when I can go to bed at night and put my head down and go to sleep knowing everything that I did today was good. I could not imagine calling my buyers and say, I got busy and didn't get a chance to respond. So in the meantime, another offer came in and the seller accepted and we're under contract. Do you want to go back out and look for more properties? I can't imagine. I can't imagine, but it happens all the time. I was doing an open house a couple years ago and this couple came in and they went through the house and I said, you know, what did you guys have any questions? And they said, no, we're just kind of out looking. They said, we're a little defeated. They said, we had a home and we made an offer and the seller verbally accepted our offer. But before they could sign, another offer came in and they accepted that one. And then they said, We don't play that game. And I thought, well, it's not really a game, is it? It's contract formation, it's law. So the fact that that communication never happened, and I'm so sorry for those people, but we must have those two things. So I'm getting some questions in about communication. I'll address those in just a second. Yep, I'll address those in just a second. Any question? Two things, you guys. Two things. The last offer or, I'm sorry, the last offeree accepts, and then communication must cross the line. They had an agent. So let's talk about how we can communicate. How we can communicate acceptance. Basically, any form of communication is okay as long as the parties agree to it. That's the key. As long as the parties agree to it. So we're going to break these down. We've got traditional electronic means, but anything is okay as long as the parties agree to it. So we could go old school, pick up the phone and say, we've accepted, leave a voicemail. Don't you have a date and a time stamp when you leave a voicemail? If you just call, you never communicated acceptance, right? If you don't leave a message. So you need to have it, leave a voicemail, communicate acceptance. Fax, that's like really old school, but you may still use a fax machine. We could go old school and go mailing, snail mail. There is in your book, I'm just going to point this out, in your book on page 286, it talks about the mailbox rule. And what the mailbox rule says is that communication of acceptance takes place when the properly addressed envelope has been placed in the federally related mailbox. Communication per the mailbox rule, which, guys, is probably one of the oldest rules we got. This goes back to like the days of the old Pony Express, way back in the day. The mailbox rule says that once the properly addressed envelope has been placed in the mailbox, communication of acceptance has happened. It doesn't matter that the recipient won't get it for like 3 to 7 days or however long it's taken mail to go now. I'm getting ready to talk about that. The mailbox rule only applies when you're communicating acceptance of an offer. The mailbox rule doesn't apply when you're negotiating the offer. It doesn't apply when you're terminating a contract. It only applies when you're communicating acceptance of an offer. Then our more modern terms, how we're handling things today, typically our electronic means, email. The rules of email say that communication of acceptance happens when it hits the recipient's inbox. Not when you send it and not when I open it, but when it hits my inbox. So email communication of acceptance has happened once it hits my inbox or the recipient's inbox. E-signatures are acceptable. Remember, we looked at the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act last week. E-signatures are acceptable. Text, you know, I kind of prefer text or email because you have documentation. You have a date and a time stamp. And what do we document? Everything. So let's say, for example, and again, for your exam, I want you to draw this out. I want you to see what we're looking at here. So we got the buyer, the agent, and the buyer on one side. The buyer's the offeror, the seller's the offeree. So the buyer makes an offer through their agent. The buyer's agent presents it to the listing agent. The listing agent calls their seller and says, we got an offer. What do you think? The seller says, I accept it. And then they tell their agent, the listing agent, that they accept. Are we under contract? When the seller calls their agent, are we under contract? Everybody shake your head no. We're not under contract yet. I got step 1 of 2, but not both steps yet, right? So when the seller calls their agent, and then the listing agent calls or communicates with the buyer's agent, communication has crossed the line and now we're under contract. Let's say when the listing agent communicates with the buyer's agent, they first leave a voicemail, and then they send a text, and then they email the actual offer. When it comes to communication of acceptance, it only has to cross the line one time. Everything else here is a follow-up. Why don't you guys tell me in a chat, private chat, 1, 2, or 3, which form of communication put us under contract? 1, 2, or 3. Which form of communication put us under contract? And the one, we only need one. Let's first off understand that. I only need to cross the line once. And the one that puts us under contract is the first time the communication crossed the line. So when I call the buyer's agent and leave a voicemail and say, my guys have accepted, we are under contract. I then send a text, that's me following up. I then send an email because I want to make sure you got my message, dang it. So I'm going to keep on you until I write 2 and 3, and anything else after that is just making sure that you got my voicemail that put us under contract. So remember that test question I told you were going to see that's like this long? There are several different forms of communication. I text and then I follow up with an email. We only got to cross the line one time, which is again why I want you guys to draw it, because I want you to see that time, that magic moment in time.
Miss Julie, so but all 3 are ways. So all 3 would work, right? Any 3
They would work, but that wasn't
Okay.
the question. The question was,
Right, okay.
which one put us under contract?
Contract. Okay, so and that's what we got to pay attention
The next
to.
transaction you and I work together, maybe I email you first, and then I leave you a voicemail and say, hey, Lynn, I just sent you an email. That email in that case is what put us under contract, right? The email is just me, or whatever I just said. You with me? So is that good? You just got to cross the line one time, and I want you guys to see the line. And I think the best way to see the line is to draw it, walk it back and forth, have your counter offers, have your communications. A question came in about a counter offer. Yeah, go ahead.
Me? I was wondering, so when you're under contract, when it crosses the line, I hear and understand that. And then I guess where I'm trying to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, and I hope this doesn't confuse anybody else, but is the next thing that makes it kind of move over into that statute of frauds is when they've like signed it, that contract is then in, like, it'll hold up.
For your exam, when you see accept, know that it's been signed.
Okay, I don't know why
When you see the word accept, when it says accept, it has, because if you got verbal, what you got? Absolutely nothing. So for your exam, when you see that it's accepted or it's been accepted, know that it's been signed. Let's see. Yes, and that's right. Shouldn't the buyer's agent? That's right. So now once the buyer's agent's been communicated, the next thing they want to do is pick up the phone and call their buyer and tell the buyer the good news. And again, it's not, we're close. Are you still sure you want this house? That phone call is, congratulations, you got it. We are under contract. So once the agent knows, isn't that the courteous thing to do, is to call your client and fill them in on the good news as well? I think so. Let's see. How formal is a counter offer? Again, whatever form of communication the parties agree to. If you're countering face-to-face or on the phone, I would suggest following it up with a text or an email, because what do we document? Everything. But remember too, you guys, what the parole evidence rule says. If the final written word doesn't make it to the contract, then it doesn't matter. So if you're negotiating verbally, you still got to make notes, right? Because the final written word isn't going to count. So make sure you're documenting, not just for, because I told you to, but for, you know, that purpose as well too. Let's see, what happens if the buyer or seller accept via phone, but then change their mind and refuse to sign? That's going to get tricky, isn't it? And if they accept via phone, then we don't have acceptance. See, if you have a verbal signature, I can say, yeah, I'm going to sign this later today. I accept, and I'll sign later today. Are we under contract? No, because I don't have written, right? So you get the written and then you communicate acceptance. If you got verbal, you got nothing. That's awesome. Somebody just said they were going to get a tattoo that says document everything. And you're going to put it right here on your forearm, right? So you can say, what do I document? Everything. I love it. All right. So let's look at an example, a couple examples in Unit 10. An owner offers to sell to a prospective buyer. The offer states that acceptance must be made by email message only. The offer states that acceptance must be made by email message only. What's the only acceptable form of communication? Email. Instead, the prospective buyer leaves a phone message informing the seller that he accepted and signed the offer. Guess what? You don't have a legally accepted offer, because communication can happen in any form that the parties agree to. If they don't agree to phone, then that's not an acceptable form of communication. Everybody with me on that? Whatever form of communication the parties agree to. The other thing I want to say, just, I'm sure I'll say it again, and I might have already said it, but it's really important. I want to make sure that we hear it. The seller is free to accept any offer that they choose at any time. The seller is free to accept any offer at any time. So if you're the listing agent and you get an offer in today, and you have, let's say you get an offer in this morning, and you know you have a showing this afternoon, and you call your seller and you say, I have an offer in my hand, let's discuss it. And you say, by the way, we do have a showing this afternoon. Does the seller have to wait for that showing? No. What if the offer they have in their hand is the dream offer, everything that they ever wanted? Do they have to wait for that showing? No, because the seller is free to accept any offer at any time. What if you have an offer in your hand, the showing has happened, and the buyer's agent has said, my guys are very interested and we will be presenting an offer within the hour? Do you have to wait on that offer that you know is coming? Do you have to wait on it? No, because the seller is free to accept any offer at any time. Even if you have others coming, if you know you have others coming, they don't have to wait. Could they? Sure. Maybe this isn't the dream offer and they say, well, this one's all right, but let's see what happens this afternoon. You guys with me? That's up to the seller. Questions, comments? Bottom of page 286, we talk about termination of an offer. Please note, this is terminating. This is terminating an offer. This is not terminating a contract. So how do you terminate an offer? Well, we've already said a rejection or a counter offer will terminate an offer. The offeror, the person making the offer, may put an expiration date on their offer. The person making the offer may say this offer is good until 5 p.m. on April 19th. If the offeree doesn't accept within that time, at 5 p.m. tonight, the offer is terminated. The offer can also terminate within a reasonable amount of time. Who decides what a reasonable amount of time is? Well, I guess ultimately the judge will determine for us if we need it to. But here's something else that's really important for you guys. The offeree, no, I'm sorry, the offeror, the person making the offer is free to take back their offer at any time prior to acceptance. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. So if the offeror feels that the offeree has had it for a reasonable amount of time, they can revoke their offer. They can take it back. Prior to acceptance, again, the offeror can revoke their offer. They can take it back. And then death of either party will terminate an offer. Please note, death is only an out when you're negotiating the offer. Death is not an out once you're under contract. Death is only an out when you're negotiating the offer. Once you're under contract, you're bound. And should your buyer or seller pass away, once you're under contract, their heirs are expected to carry through with the terms of the contract. And if they don't, they're in breach. They'll suffer those consequences of breach. Once you're under contract, you have a signed document that says, I have intentions of selling or buying this house. Death is not an out once you're under contract. Does that, I mean, I'm sure it does every day. I've never had it happen to me, but I know agents have had it happen. I had an agent once, her seller got arrested and went to jail like the day before settlement. So, you know, things happen, right? We're getting ready to talk about due diligence when we get into just a second. Yep, bear with me just a second.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned once, you know, you sign it and death occurs, and what if the heirs just don't want to follow through and you say that it's a breach of contract, then what will happen?
They suffer the consequences of breach that are spelled out in the contract that we're getting ready to talk about. Remember last week when we defined a contract, a legal contract has to have a remedy in case one party breaches. So the contract has to spell out what that breach is.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah.
So with death, what if the agent communicated already to the other parties? Does that,
Under contract,
does
you
that
have
terminate?
acceptance and you have communication of acceptance, and we're under contract.
Not signed, but just communicated?
If you don't have it signed, then you don't have a contract.
Okay,
You have to have. So if they say, yeah, I accept, and I'll do it later, hang up the phone and then pass away, we never formed a contract, right? Because you don't have a signature.
okay.
What if, I hear you guys. The contract spells out the terms of breach. If either party can't carry through with what they promised in the contract, they are in breach. I mean, think about it. If the buyer passes away, are they going to get loan approval? Probably not. It's kind of hard to make money when you're no longer with us, right? So the buyer almost always, not unless their family just wants to buy the house. And again, what are those consequences of breach? It's spelled out in our contract. We'll see it. If you have a signed contract but no communication, then you don't have a contract. You have a signed offer. Because I have to have two things to have a contract: sign the offer and communicate acceptance. Isn't contract law fun? And this just doesn't apply to our standard contract. This is leases. What if your landlord or tenant die? You know, what if the landlord dies? Does the tenant have to get out? No, lease still continues, right? Landlord has heirs. If the heirs don't honor that lease, they will suffer the consequences of the breach. Okay. So we're getting ready to take our break. And when we come back, we're going to do our review of our offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T. Before we go though, I just want to point out, again, like we did with the agency agreements, I went through 2T and highlighted the provisions that are discussed in your syllabus. So that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to focus on. But also please note, starting on page 287, the whole way to 292, 287 to 292, talks about the provisions in your offer to purchase and contract that we're getting ready to look at. So same thing with our agency agreements. The suggested activity as you go through standard form 2T with your book 287 to 292 in your hand. So that's where we're going to go. But first, let's take a break, get another cup of coffee, and we'll come back in 10 and we'll look at our offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T. All right. Go back. Open back. So I am going to take attendance. And we're going to spend a little bit of time. I'm in Learn Test Pass in the Unit 10 material. And in the Unit 10 material, we have what our focus is the offer to purchase and contract. This is standard form 2T. Again, the highlighted things, the things that you see highlighted are the things that are mentioned in the syllabus. So I went through and we're going to go through and talk about these together. First off, please note, we're looking at an offer to purchase and upon acceptance becomes a contract. This form serves two purposes. We can use it to negotiate the offer, the terms of the offer, present the offer, and upon acceptance, it becomes a legally binding contract. Some states use two forms. Some states have an offer and another form is a contract. So thank you, North Carolina Forms Committee, for helping us out and just giving us one form for two purposes. Good so far? I appreciate them for that. All right. The first provision of our contract is terms and definitions. The first provision is the first 2.5 pages, and this is by far where we're spending most of our time. So if you don't do anything else with this, please look at the terms and definitions. We're going to spend the first 2.5 pages just defining things. Okay, so terms and definitions. The first thing we need to define is who's the seller and who's the buyer. So we need to list the parties to the contract. I need full legal names of all parties, all sellers that have to sign the deed and their spouses. I need full legal names of all the buyers that plan on purchasing, that plan on being on the deed as well. Mr. and Mrs. is not acceptable. We each have our own name. So for example, if you're working with a married couple, let's say you're helping my husband and I, you would not put Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Campbell. That's not my name. You would spell us out. He's Ryan L. Campbell and I'm Julie A. Campbell. The next thing you need to do is define the property. We have a place to put in the street address, city, zip, county, North Carolina. And then we also have a place for our legal description. We're told to complete all applicable. So what subdivision is it in? What's the plat lot, the tax pin, deed book and page. So we need to fill in as much information as we can. Remember in Unit 4 when we talked about our legal descriptions, and we said when you're conveying property, the street address alone is not sufficient. So when you're conveying property, the street address alone is not sufficient. So in addition to the street address, we include all applicable of our legal description. I'm going to skip the purchase price for now because I think we need to define due diligence, earnest money, and all this other stuff first. So I will come back to this. Okay, is everybody good with that? I will come back to it, but we need to define what some stuff means first. So we're going to skip ahead. And on page 2, we define what the earnest money deposit is. There's 2 deposits made by the buyer when we go under contract. The first one is earnest money. We'll talk about the other one in just a second. The earnest money is paid by the buyer upon contract formation, and it sits in a trust account or an escrow account. An escrow account is held by an impartial third party. It's just a holding account. It's a safeguarding place for the earnest money to sit. The amount of the earnest money deposit is completely negotiable. There is no formula. There is no, well, if the purchase price is this much, then the earnest money should be that much. The amount of the earnest money deposit is completely negotiable. The Real Estate Commission is quite helpful when it comes to helping us understand the earnest money and the other deposit. The Real Estate Commission says, whatever the buyer is willing to offer and the seller is willing to accept. It's a completely negotiable amount. Earnest money doesn't make for a valid contract. For example, if the buyer offers 0 and the seller accepts 0, we still have a valid contract, right? Buyer made an offer, seller accepted, but how much earnest money do I have? 0. So it's completely negotiable. It doesn't make or break the validity of a contract. Again, the earnest money deposit hangs out in an escrow account. We'll talk in just a minute about what happens to the monies. The purpose of the earnest money is for the buyer to show the seller their good faith. The earnest money deposit allows the buyer to say, I'm truly interested in your property. I'm not just out here kicking tires and wasting your time. Let me go on. We'll come back, talk more about this in just a second. We define who the escrow agent is, who is holding the earnest money. Maybe it's the real estate firm. Maybe it's a closing attorney. But somebody has to have a trust account, has to have an escrow account. The very last thing, one of the last things we talk about is the trust account, escrow accounts. Well, there's rules regarding that. What we have, those typically real estate firms or the closing attorney will hold the earnest money. A little bit further down, we define the effective date. The effective date of the contract is the last one has signed and such signing is communicated. What are the two things we need to go from an offer to a contract? I need acceptance, and then we need communication of acceptance. And that in our contract defines what the effective date is. So the effective date, the last one that signs, and the signing is communicated. And then we go down and define the due diligence fee, and due diligence period. So 2 deposits. One is the earnest money. The other deposit is the due diligence fee. The due diligence fee is paid by the buyer upon contract formation, and it's paid directly to the seller. The buyer cuts a check to the seller for the due diligence fee. And what the buyer is paying the seller for is the right to terminate for no reason or any reason, for any reason or no reason during the due diligence period. Once we go under contract, the buyer has a due diligence period. The due diligence period is their opportunity to investigate and learn as much about the property as they possibly can to decide, now knowing what I know, do I want to move forward with this contract or terminate? And the buyer pays the seller for that right to terminate. For what reason? Any reason or no reason at all. What if they have a really bad home inspection? Everything's broke, nothing works. Can the buyer terminate for a reason? Is that a reason to terminate? Absolutely. They don't want to deal with it, so they choose to terminate. What if the buyer literally wakes up the next day and says, nah, I don't want to buy this house? Can they terminate? Is that a reason? Not really. But due diligence says that they have the right to terminate for any reason or no reason at all during the due diligence period. The due diligence fee is also negotiable. Whatever the buyer's willing to offer and the seller's willing to accept. Again, there's no formula. It's not a percentage of anything. We're seeing high due diligence and high earnest money in this market. I've heard like $50,000 in due diligence. Where do these people get this kind of money? That's what I want to know. I'm looking in the wrong place. Probably when the market adjusts and comes back, we're going to see due diligence and earnest money amounts start coming back down. You guys remember Caveat Emptor? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to tell you that I got offered, I didn't accept it because they offered a low ball on the purchase price, but they offer 25,000 due diligence fee. And
Yep,
I got
that's-
excited. My realtor was like, no.
No, that's exactly what's happening right now. Like I said, when that market adjusts, we're gonna start see this coming down. Absolutely. I'm getting there. Give me just 1 second, please. So the due diligence, you guys remember caveat emptor? What's caveat emptor say? That's our buyer beware, right? Due diligence, the buyer's due diligence period, think of this as the response to caveat emptor. Buyer beware says the seller has to disclose what? What does the seller have to disclose? Nothing. Does the seller have to fix anything? Do they have to repair anything? Do they have to do anything? All the seller has to do is put a sign in their front yard and sign an acceptable contract. Yes, that's all they have to do. And due diligence says, hang on, if the onus is on the buyer to learn everything about the property, then shouldn't they be given a grace period? Shouldn't they be given time to learn, to decide if they want to move forward? And that's what the due diligence period is about. It's helping the buyer learn everything. They're doing their inspections and their investigations, and they're learning everything that they possibly can. And should they not be satisfied, they have an out. And that's their due diligence period.
Miss Julie,
Yes.
sometimes I'll see a listing and it was on the market pending and looks like it's gonna go through, and then it's back on the market and the listing will say, due to no fault of the sellers, blah, 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 blah.
Mhm.
Would that a lot of times maybe be when one of the buyers just changed their mind or found
Could change
another
their
house
mind.
they
Maybe
like
didn't get loan
better?
approval. Maybe they found that the roof leaked and they didn't want to mess with it.
And so they'll put that in the listing to maybe not have a stigma attached to the property too.
You know, it's not the seller's responsibility to repair the roof. It's the buyer deciding they don't want to, right?
Right.
So you see that a lot, no fault of the sellers. In other words, it's the buyer that chose to terminate is what
Mhm.
we're told in that. Yep. So what happens to this due diligence and earnest money? First off, let's talk about what if we make it to closing. I hate starting with doom and gloom and talking about terminating. If we make it to closing, the earnest money and the due diligence both will be credited back to the buyer. So this is why we can think of earnest money and due diligence as deposits. They prepay these amounts, earnest money and due diligence, upon contract formation. They're basically making a deposit with their purchase price. So if we make it to closing, both earnest money and due diligence will be credited back to the buyer. All right, doom and gloom. Do they all close? Unfortunately not. So what happens if we don't make it to closing? The seller will almost always get to keep the due diligence fee. The seller will almost always get to keep, because what is the buyer paying for? The right to terminate. So if they exercise their right to terminate, that's what they paid for. They paid for that right. If we terminate within due diligence, the seller will keep the due diligence fee and the buyer will get their earnest money deposit back. I'll say that again. If we terminate within due diligence, the due diligence period, the seller keeps the due diligence fee. That's what the buyer paid for, is that right to terminate. But the buyer will get their earnest money back because they exercise their right to terminate within the due diligence period. If we terminate after due diligence, the buyer is considered in breach. During due diligence, they're not in breach because they have that right to terminate. They have that option. They have that privilege, if you will. If we terminate after due diligence for any reason, now the buyer's in breach, the seller will still keep the due diligence fee, and now the seller will get the earnest money. So within due diligence, buyer gets their earnest money back. After due diligence, the seller will get the earnest money. The only time that the seller may have to give back the due diligence fee is if the seller's in breach. So if the seller chooses to terminate the contract. Remember, we talked about our compensatory damages in Unit 9. Can the buyer, if the seller's in breach, can the buyer prove with receipts and invoices that they paid a due diligence fee, that they paid an earnest money, that they paid for the home inspection, the appraisal, all those things in connection with their investigations? That could be what the buyer could go after the breaching seller for. Those are our compensatory damages. And due diligence could be one of those if the seller's not willing to write the check. When the seller receives due diligence fee, that's their money to keep forever and ever, unless they breach. Some sellers say, well, I'll just put this in my wallet and deposit it after we close. No, get it in the bank today. That's your money. I need to make sure it clears. Sometimes those things bounce. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen. The buyer's due diligence period, beginning on the effective date and extending through 5 p.m. on whatever date we agree to, completely negotiable. Time being of the essence. What do we mean by time being of the essence? You guys remember that from Unit 9? Time being of the essence says what? Pretty much. Time being of the essence is our drop dead date and time. The buyer has a due diligence period to terminate up until 5 p.m. on this date. At 5:01, they are in breach. How long is the due diligence period? Completely negotiable. Is it 2 weeks? Is it 2 months? You're not going to see 2 months, but it's completely negotiable. As the buyer's agent, you want to make sure that you have enough time for the buyer to get their investigations done, to get the appraisal done. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So now that we've defined, a question came in, due diligence paying the seller to move their listing off the market for a certain period of time. And thank you for asking that, because that is a common misconception. The buyer is not paying the seller to take their home off the market. The buyer is paying the seller for the right to terminate. Sellers don't have to take their home off the market when we go under contract. Sellers can still allow showings. Sellers can have what's called a backup contract, which we'll look at in just a second. Thank you for bringing that up, because that is a very common, like I said, misconception. The buyer's not paying the seller to take their home off the market. They're paying the seller for the right to terminate. For what reason? For any reason or no reason at all. I had a coworker once who had buyers terminate because they drove by the home one evening and saw that the sun set in the backyard, that side of the house. And they said, well, we like to grill out at night, and it's going to be hard to grill out with the sun. So we're going to terminate. We need to find a backyard that doesn't face the west. Is that a reason? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But during due diligence, can they terminate for any reason or no reason? That's the answer to caveat emptor. That's why we have the due diligence period. So let's go back. Now that we've defined some things, let's talk about this purchase price. Remember, if we go to closing, the earnest money and the due diligence will both be credited back to the buyer. So we start with the purchase price, whatever the buyer is willing to pay. And I'm just going to make some numbers up. You see these blanks. Anytime you see a blank in a form, that's a negotiable point. That's an agreement that the buyer and seller have to come to. So let's say our purchase price is 100,000. Again, I'm just making numbers up. We have 200 in due diligence and 500 in earnest money. Those amounts will both be credited back to the buyer, which means at settlement, they only need to bring $93,000. They've prepaid $700. Does that make sense to you guys? They've already paid that money once. So if we get to closing, it will get credited back to them. We're told that our due diligence fee is made payable and delivered to the seller by the effective date in whatever form we agree to: personal check, wire transfer, electronic transfer, etc. Question came in: is earnest money typically higher than due diligence? Again, there's no rhyme or reason. Those are numbers I just made up. Maybe they're the same, maybe one's more, maybe one's less. Whatever the buyer's willing to offer and the seller's willing to accept. Okay. Earnest money is made payable and delivered to the escrow agent. So it's important that we know who gets this money. The buyer is literally writing a check to the seller for due diligence. Do I have everybody with that? The buyer is writing a check or doing a cashier's check or wire transfer, whatever, directly to the seller. The earnest money sits in an escrow account, and we define who that escrow agent is. Now, earnest money could come all at once in the form of initial earnest money. It could come maybe in 2 different payments, or maybe later for additional and initial. It's all still earnest money. It's all still the same thing. It's just a matter of when, how we negotiate, how we work it out, and when we're going to pay. You'll note if we do additional, we also have a time is of the essence. The additional earnest money has a specific date and time on it, 5 p.m. on this date. We'll look at this other stuff in just a second, but you take your 100,000, your 200 due diligence, and your 500 earnest money. And then at the very bottom here, we have a balance of the purchase price in cash at settlement. This is now how much the buyer has to bring to closing, some of all which may be paid with the proceeds of a new loan. So earnest money and due diligence, think of them as their down payments. So that $25,000 Lynn was offered, had she accepted and those guys closed, that's $25,000 less that those buyers would have to bring to closing. Everybody with me? It's a deposit. Did I do that wrong? Yeah, whatever my math is. Thank you. But we get the point. That's my other point, is make sure your math is right on this. That's why I don't go off calculator. Thank you. The other lines we have in here again are for other deposits. So you might have a loan assumption. We're going to talk a little bit more about a loan assumption. The buyer assumes the seller's loan. We'll talk about that when we get to our financing. Seller financing, the seller may act as the lending institution. They may finance the property, or building deposit if it's a new construction. So all of these lines in between are deposits. You start with the purchase price, you deduct all the deposits, and then you have the final balance of the purchase price in cash at settlement. Just an FYI, I mentioned earlier, sometimes those things bounce, due diligence or earnest money. So this paragraph addresses that. It's not highlighted, so it's not testable. But I want you to know that the contract covers that. What happens if they bounce? Because sometimes they do. What questions do I have on due diligence, earnest money, due diligence fee, due diligence period?
I got one.
Mhm.
So I just didn't hear exactly what you said earlier. So if the buyer terminates after the due diligence, they are in breach and the seller keeps the fee?
If they correct, if the buyer terminates after due diligence, now the buyer's not considered in breach until we pass due diligence, because they have that right to terminate within due diligence.
Right.
So if they terminate for any reason, including failure to get loan approval, after due diligence, if they terminate for any reason, the seller will still keep the due diligence fee, and now the seller gets the earnest money.
Hello,
Okay.
this is she.
I think you're on the phone and on mute.
I'm good. How are you?
All right, so let me do that. No phone calls, please. It's hard to listen to earnest money and due diligence. Kind of important for your test and life. What other questions?
I do.
Yeah.
It's not really a question, just me noticing that with due diligence and due diligence, I'm sorry, I'm kind of country, how one may get those two confused because it's talking about the time period situation.
So that you're talking about the due diligence period?
Then
So, and we got 2 dates in the contract to negotiate that we'll see in just a second. We got to negotiate the due diligence date. We also have to negotiate when we're going to close. So there's 2 different dates to consider. There's 2 different things to consider. And we're getting ready to go to closing in just 1 second. Yep. So again, and to your point, the due diligence period, the date I'm putting in here is the buyer's last opportunity to terminate the contract for any reason or no reason. And usually there's a period of time, completely negotiable. Is it a week? Is it 4 weeks? Whatever. Completely negotiable between due diligence and settlement, due diligence and closing, to finalize things, to firm things up. If the buyer terminates after due diligence, buyer's in breach. Everybody good with that? Buyer's in breach when they terminate after due diligence. The seller keeps the due diligence fee. Now the seller gets the earnest money. The due diligence fee and the earnest money together are the seller's liquidated damages. Remember back in Unit 9, we talked about liquidated damages. And liquidated damages are money damages that we agree to at contract formation. So aren't these are completely negotiable items, right? You could put $5 in here, you could put $50,000 in here. Completely negotiable. And the seller accepts that if the buyer breaches, the due diligence fee and the earnest money are their liquidated damages. Again, as this pendulum swings back, we'll get out of this market. I had never, until about 1.5 years ago, heard of a dang 5-digit due diligence and earnest money amount. I mean, that's just, you know, but now here we are. That pendulum will come back and there'll be more reasonable numbers. But it all serves as the seller's liquidated damages.
Julie?
Yeah.
Okay, so during the due diligence period, does the buyer get both the earnest and due diligent money back?
The buyer will never get the due diligence back. The only time the buyer will get their due diligence fee back is if the seller is in breach. But the buyer pays the seller for what? The right to terminate. That's what they pay. The seller can't sue the buyer because the buyer paid for that right. And if the buyer terminates within due diligence, they have exercised their right to terminate. The buyer will get the earnest money back if they terminate within due diligence. As long as they exercise their right to terminate within due diligence, the seller keeps the due diligence fee and the buyer will get their earnest money back. How would the seller breach? If the seller chooses to terminate the contract at any time. What if the seller finds out they can't pass clear marketable title? They can't perform what they promised to do, right? What if the seller, guys, I had a seller once, we went under contract. Yay, they were so hot and heavy to sell this house like yesterday, ASAP. We go under contract. I'm not kidding you. Next week, they called me and said, guess what? We found out we're pregnant. I said, oh, yay. And they said, so we don't want to sell our house. And I said, well, probably something like that. I said, y'all have a legally binding contract. If you terminate, you're in breach. Well, what happens if we're in breach? I'm not an attorney. I can tell you what the contract says, but I can't tell you. You guys with me? I can't give you that legal advice. They ended up selling their house. They were not happy about it. But just because your change in life happens doesn't mean that's an outright. If the seller terminates for any reason, they are in breach. The consequences for seller breach are much harsher than buyer breach. And we'll see breach in just a second. But the reason for that, why it's harsher for the seller than the buyer, because the seller's the one that initiated this whole thing to begin with by putting a for sale sign in their front yard. The seller's the one that started this chain of events that led us here. Does that make sense? So consequences for seller breach are much harsher than buyer breach. I had a question come in about the legal description. Where do you get this information? That comes with training from your firm. So you can start with like the county GIS, register of deeds, tax records, that kind of thing, where you get a lot of this information. What else on the due diligence and earnest money? Again, I think you guys, this is all on page 2. Y'all make a note, page 2 of the offer to purchase and contract. It defines it. And again, at the end, we'll talk about breach. It spells out the terms of breach for both parties.
Julie,
Yep.
I'm going back to due diligence with that
Come on.
question.
Let's go.
Okay, so they don't get the money back, but it does go, if they close, the due diligence and earnest goes towards the down payment.
That's correct. It's credited back to them at closing. That's right.
Okay,
So they won't get a check back. You're right. They're not going to get a check. But now they only have to come up with the funds for whatever the purchase price minus those.
and that
Those amounts.
earnest and due diligence goes into escrow.
Due diligence does not go to escrow.
Okay,
Earnest money goes to escrow. Due diligence goes directly to the
So-
seller.
okay,
The
okay.
buyer actually cuts a check to Mr. and Mrs. Seller.
Okay, I wrote that down, but I wasn't clear.
I know it takes a second to, I get it. Okay, so if the seller breaches at any time, maybe we're in due diligence, maybe we're not. Anytime from day 1 to closing that the seller terminates, they are in breach. The buyer's not considered in breach until after due diligence. Remember when in our agency units and we were talking about this idea of a ready, willing, and able buyer? Some attorneys, some judges may argue that you don't have a ready, willing, and able buyer until after due diligence, until the buyers had the opportunity to investigate and learn about the property. And again, deciding, now knowing what I know, do I want to move forward with, or do I want to terminate this transaction? And here it defines the due diligence. Buyer's opportunity to investigate the property contemplated by this contract, including but not necessarily limited to, to decide whether in the buyer's sole discretion will proceed with or terminate the transaction. That's the whole gist of due diligence, is for the buyer to decide if they want to proceed with or terminate the transaction. Okay. Still defining things. We're still on terms and definitions. We need to define settlement and closing. Y'all want some mind-blowing information? Anybody ever bought a house? Has anybody ever bought a house before or sold a house? And your agent probably said, we're going to go to closing on this date. We're going to go to closing. We're going to go to closing. Y'all want to know something? I've been in this industry of coming up on 21 years. I've never in my entire life been to closing. What we actually attend, what we actually do is referred to as settlement. Every single one of us in this industry have a bad habit of referring to closing as settlement, and you will too one day, I promise. But for your tests, we need to understand that there is a difference in settlement and closing. Settlement is defined as the proper execution and delivery to the closing attorney of all documents necessary to complete the transaction, and the closing attorney's receipt of all funds necessary to complete the transaction. Settlement is when agent and client, buyer, seller, go to the attorney's office, sign documents, bring any funds, the buyer will have money to bring. If the seller's underwater, the seller will have money to bring as well. If the seller's underwater, they owe more than the property's worth. So sometimes sellers have to bring money as well. The settlement date is a negotiated date. So we agree on a date when we're negotiating the offer. Again, I mean, you could do due diligence and settlement on the same day, but it's pretty rare. Usually there's a period of time in between due diligence ending and when we actually go to settlement. Once buyers and sellers and their agents leave the settlement, leave the closing attorney's office, then the attorney does closing. And closing is defined as the completion of the legal process, which results in the transfer of title from the seller to the buyer. Closing includes the following steps: settlement, which we defined above, the completion of a satisfactory title update. Remember, we talked about the title search, title insurance, title opinion, and Unit 5. That's the attorney's job. The closing attorney's receipt to disperse all necessary funds and authorization to disperse all necessary funds. And then the very last act, the very last step, is to record at the Register of Deeds the buyer's brand new deed. Then and only then is it a done deal. It's not a done deal until the buyer's brand new deed is recorded at the Register of Deeds. Most of the time, we all work really hard for settlement and closing to happen on the same day. We all try really, really hard. Most attorneys won't schedule settlement after like 3 p.m. because they want us to get in and get out and then they can record. Things happen sometimes though. Does the internet go down? Sometimes. Does a wire transfer fund not come in? Sometimes. Do we forget to get a buyer's signature when we got to have them come back? Things happen. If you go to settlement and closing doesn't happen, then it's not the buyer's property yet. We should not be given the buyers access to the property until it's theirs. And it's not theirs until that brand new deed is on record. Now, I'm sure you guys, please stop. I know you have personal experience where you got the key at the attorney's office, or you know somebody that got the key. It happens all the time. But remember, there's real world and then there's pre-licensing world. And our contract even tells us that we're not supposed to be doing that. We'll see that in just a bit. Our contract says buyers should not be getting possession of the property until it's theirs. One of the biggest reasons why not, insurance. If it's not theirs, they're not insured, right? And it's not theirs until that deed is recorded. We'll see that verbiage in just a second. So settlement is what we all attend. We go with our clients, we sit at the attorney's office. Once we leave settlement, then the attorney does closing, with the last act of closing being to record at the Register of Deeds. By the way, that's Register of Deeds of the county that the property is located. I don't care where you're standing. It's the county where the property is located. Settlement versus closing. Is that mind blowing? It's a habit. It's just a bad habit. But we need to understand that there is a difference. I've never in my entire life been to closing, ever.
Julie?
Yeah.
Okay, on page 290, under settlement date, the last sentence, a settlement agent will not disperse funds until after the recordation of the deed.
Correct.
Can you explain that as opposed to closing?
Closing, the last step of closing is to record the new deed.
Okay, so after, once that's done, then the settlement agent will give the funds?
That's right. That's right. The seller doesn't get paid. You and I don't get paid. The buyer shouldn't get keys. None of that should happen until that deed is recorded, because that's the only thing, that's the only time that it's done, is when that deed records. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Good point. And by the way, this says deed and deed of trust. Remember in North Carolina, we're just fancy and we call our mortgage the deed of trust. So if the buyer's getting a lender, if the buyer's getting a loan, then they'll have a mortgage or a deed of trust. We'll talk about that in units 14 and 15. Anything else on settlement and closing? Did y'all hear what I just said? I don't get paid until it closes. When do I go back and get my check? I get an email from I go to settlement, I go about my day, do my thing, and at some point I get an email from usually the paralegal that says, we are on record. And when I see that email, that's when I know I can do a big squealing U-turn in the middle of the road and go back to the attorney's office and get my check. That's when I get paid. Actually, let me rephrase that, get my firm's check. So I can take that check back to the firm so then I can get paid. Same thing, buyers can't get keys, shouldn't get access until that deed is recorded. And I know every single one of us have stories about happening otherwise. And I'm sorry to tell you, but that's not right. Per the terms of the contract. Are we good? It's awfully early to be getting sleepy.
I have a question with that.
Yeah.
What if the seller just say, hey, you can have but they put it in the contract, even though you guys ain't settled the contract, like closing. What if the seller put in the contract, once we get to a certain point in the contract, I give you access to the property, even though it's not settled.
I do have a form called a buyer possession before closing. So if the parties agree to let the buyers move in before closing, absolutely. Remember, the parties can agree to anything, right? But I have a form for that. Okay. Still defining things. The last thing defined in the first provision is special assessments. Special assessments can be a charge on the property either by the government. Maybe they're doing it. Remember, we talked about our government special assessments and our lien priority. We said government special assessments are superior liens. If the government is putting a special assessment on a property, they might be installing street lights or sidewalks or hooking an entire neighborhood up to public sewer, for example. Special assessments could also be by an HOA. So if an HOA is putting a special assessment on, maybe they're redoing the roofs at a condo complex or repaint the parking lot or something. So here we just define special assessments. We'll talk about everybody's responsibility for special assessments in just a second. Again, y'all make a note. The first, the first 2.5 pages, page 1, page 2, are so important because they help us define these things, help us define what some of these terms are. The second provision is about fixtures. Remember, we talked about fixtures back in unit 2. So we have to address fixtures in our contract. This is what, the third time now we've seen this fixture list. We talked about it in unit 2. This exact same list shows up in our listing agreement. So when we're meeting with the seller for the first time, if the seller says they want to take the dogwood that was planted when Junior was born, we've watched the dogwood grow with Junior. Unless we make arrangements for them to take it, it's a fixture and it needs to stay. So this is why we have the conversation about fixtures with the sellers back in the day when we're listing the property. So when an offer comes in, we know if it's going to be a fixture or not. So go through this list with the sellers. Newer verbiage in our contract, a sign of the times, right? About unpairing or deleting data from devices. Our homes are getting awfully smart, aren't they? And you got Ring doorbells and you got all sorts of other contractions that you can hook up to your phone. Y'all know you can have a smart refrigerator now. So when you're in the grocery store, if you can't remember if you need milk, you just pull an app up on your phone and you can look in your refrigerator, see if you need milk or not. I'm not really there yet. I mean, you know, I'm old school, pad and pen on the refrigerator. I write milk, you know. But yeah, our homes are getting very, very smart. And anything that's going to stay, the seller needs to unpair it. They need to set back to factory default setting so the buyer can use it. I need a smart coffee pot. That's what I need. Just kind of roll over and get my app, hit the button. Maybe Santa will hook me up this year. I need that. That's okay. So other with fixtures, the other thing we talked about, items leased or not owned. We talked about this back in unit 2 as well. Any items which is leased or not owned by the seller shall not convey. And then any items that do not convey. So any fixture that the seller is going to take that they haven't already taken down, any fixture that's not going to convey, we need to spell it out here and make sure that we're all clear about what fixture. Don't just say light fixture. How many light fixtures are in a house? Specifically, which light fixture? And then we're also told seller shall repair any damage caused by the removal of any items excluded above. Fixtures is a provision. On the next page, we have personal property. So if the seller is going to leave any personal property, for example, the refrigerator, if we negotiate and agree for the seller to leave the refrigerator, we put it in personal property. Think about this. Fixtures are meant to stay. Personal property is meant to go. Everybody with me? Fixtures are meant to stay. Personal property is meant to go. If they're going to do the opposite of their intent, we need to address it in the contract. So if a fixture is going to go or personal property is going to stay, we need to spell it out. And again, be clear. Y'all don't just say the refrigerator. There have been stories, multiple stories in the past. The refrigerator is put in as personal property. Buyer goes in after closing into their brand new kitchen, and in the place of a refrigerator is like a 2-shelf dorm room fridge. Did the seller do what they were contractually obligated to do? Did they leave a refrigerator? Yeah, seller's good to go. Is the buyer happy? No. So we need to spell it out. 2-door stainless steel, Whirlpool. You know, sometimes when you open the refrigerator, you can get like a model number on the inside. If you can get that kind of information, please don't put verbiage like that was at the property at the time of showing, because that could turn into a he said, she said thing real quick in front of a judge, right? So please specify which refrigerator. You know, I'm okay with taking pictures, but I think you still need to spell it out in the contract, because remember what the parole evidence rule says, the final written word of the contract will prevail. So fixtures are meant to stay, personal property is meant to go. If they're going to do the opposite of their intent, then we need to put it in the offer to purchase and contract. Questions on fixtures or personal property? Provisions 4, 5, and 6 are all about the buyer. Provisions 4, 5, and 6 are all about the buyer. So if you're a buyer's agent, aren't these good provisions to discuss with your buyer? First up, we got the buyer's due diligence process. And it starts with a big red warning. Buyer is strongly encouraged to conduct due diligence during the due diligence period. If the buyer is not satisfied with the results or progress of the due diligence, buyer should terminate this contract prior to the expiration of the due diligence period, unless the buyer can obtain a written extension from the seller. But the seller is not obligated to grant an extension. So if you're getting near the end of due diligence, as a buyer, buyer's agent, you're getting near the end of due diligence and you need more time. Can we ask the seller for more time? Absolutely. Does the seller have to grant us more time? What would be one good way to get your buyer more time? What talks to time? More money. If your buyer wants more time, they may have to fork out additional due diligence. You guys see how this works? You got to make this desirable to the seller, because what good does this do the seller to grant them more time? Unless you can put more money in their pocket. Just a suggestion. Although buyer may continue to investigate the property following the expiration of the due diligence, buyer's failure to deliver a termination, will constitute a waiver of the buyer of any right to terminate. So in other words, again, it's so important that we understand the due diligence period is the buyer's right to terminate. They can still investigate and inspect up until the new deed is recorded. And they should be. Have you guys ever heard of the final walkthrough? For example, we'll talk more about that in a second. So the buyer doesn't necessarily stop investigating when due diligence is over. The buyers just lost their right to terminate. Keep learning, keep investigating about the property. So then this provision goes on to talk about various things that the buyer should consider doing during their due diligence period. And the first thing is going to be, if they're getting a loan, to make sure that they can get loan approval. Here's the deal. It's really, really rare to have final loan approval while we're still in due diligence. In all my years, I've only known one buyer to have loan approval while we were in due diligence. Hopefully what we can get through due diligence is we can get the appraisal done and we can get the first round back from the underwriter. And what the lender can give us in due diligence is a pretty good idea. And based on that pretty good idea, the buyer decides, now knowing what I know, do I want to terminate or proceed with the transaction? If we find out after due diligence that the buyer's not going to get loan approval, they are in breach and we will have to terminate. They'll lose their earnest money. There is not a loan contingency. Remember, we talked about a contingency last week. There is not a loan contingency. Can the parties agree to add a loan contingency? Yes, the parties can agree to anything. Is it happening in this market? Absolutely not. But again, that pendulum is going to come back. Sellers are going to be begging buyers to put a contingency on their home. So we need to get pretty good idea from the lender while we're still in due diligence. Again, we'll talk about that loan process when we get into 14 and 15. And then there's various things that the buyer can investigate. So various inspections, home inspection, pest inspection. We'll talk about all those in Unit 21. Review of the documents. If it's in an HOA, they want to review the covenants, bylaws. Insurance, they want to secure homeowners insurance while we're in due diligence. Unit 13 is dedicated to homeowners insurance. So we'll look at that when we get there. The appraisal. If the buyer's getting a loan, an appraisal is required. Period, end of story. We'll talk about that. Cash buyer doesn't have to get an appraisal. Same thing with insurance. If a lender's involved, they have to have homeowners insurance. If it's a cash buyer, highly recommended. Most of the time, buyers don't have to have a home inspection. There are some exceptions. That's their choice if they want a home inspection. Appraisal and home inspection are the only things that are required, and they're only required if a lender's involved. So not home inspection, home insurance and appraisal. Survey, zoning, flood hazard, utilities, streets, all these things that we've talked about, special assessments, fuel tanks. Again, this is just a list of things that buyers should be considering to investigate during their due diligence period. All these inspections and investigations are at the buyer's expense. Understanding that they don't have to do this. These are just things that we're recommending. And also understanding that this list isn't inclusive. So in other words, if there's something that your buyer wants to investigate that's not on this list, our answer is okey doke, let's do it. Because remember, if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. And if they say, I want to inspect this or investigate that, I say, okay, I'm not going to look at them and say, it's not on the contract, so we're not going to do it, right? The buyer's trying to learn about the home, and if it's important to them, for example, I've had a couple agents over the years tell me that their buyers, once we go under contract, have wanted to bring the priest in the home to test the vibes of the house, good vibes, bad vibes. You're not going to find this on the contract, but if your buyer wants to bring the priest over, our answer is, all right, when's good for him? You guys with me? Because if it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. Questions on that? So far, loan, property investigation. Again, we'll talk all about the loan in units 14 and 15 when we get there. Nice. See, I kind of like it. Y'all, I've walked into houses before with those front door and the teeny tiny hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. Y'all know that feeling? Yeah, I've been in those homes before. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm not saying they're good vibes or bad vibes, but I know that's something ain't right. You know? All right, so let's take 10. We come back, we keep going on our offer to purchase and contract. Yes, or pooling. All right. It's amazing what you can do in 10 minutes, isn't it? All right, so we're back. So let's take attendance.
Julie, I'm on my phone. Can you see me?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, you said I got your text at your computer.
Okay. Thank you.
Your died, yep. For today, yep. All right. Okay, so the buyer's due diligence process, get a loan approval as much as we can, a pretty good idea, investigate the property. The buyer may have have to sell or lease an existing property in order to buy. Guys, remember, we don't have contingencies built in. So we're going to address further in our contract about what happens if the buyer does have to sell or lease a property. And thank you for telling me that you're back, if you're just now getting back. We'll learn just a minute what happens if they do. But what we need to know is there are no built-in contingencies. So the parties would have to agree to add the contingency. If the buyer's saying, I can't buy your house until I sell mine, the parties would have to agree to that. Repair improvement negotiations. Buyer acknowledges and understands that unless the parties agree otherwise, and here it is, all in caps and highlighted in yellow, the property is being sold in its current condition. Does the seller have to do any repairs? No. Why? Because the property is being sold in its current condition. Homes in North Carolina are as is. The seller is not required or obligated to do any repairs. But can the seller agree to do repairs? Yeah, because the parties can agree to do whatever they want to. So this is what happens. Buyer has their inspections done and they ask the seller to do repairs. Maybe it's something with the electrical or the plumbing or pick it. Maybe the roof leaks, whatever. So the seller asks the buyer to do repairs. The seller has every right in the world to say no. Can you highlight in your book? Of course you can. The only thing I suggest you do not write in your book is the end of unit quizzes, so you can take those again and again. But yeah, go nuts, man. So the property is being sold in its current condition. The buyer has their home inspection. They ask the buyer to do repairs. I'm sorry, they ask the seller to do repairs. The seller says no. The buyer now has a decision to make. Now, knowing what I know of all the problems with this house, and I know that the seller is not willing to do any repairs. The buyer has to decide, now knowing what I know, do I want to move forward with or terminate this transaction? If the seller does agree to do repairs, I have a form for that. And if the seller agrees to do any repairs, that form actually acts as an amendment, doesn't it? Because basically we're doing away with this sentence. Now the property is not being sold in its current condition. Now it's being sold with this, this, and this fixed. So if the seller agrees to do any repairs, we're amending, in a sense, our contract. Does that make sense? We're doing away with that one sentence. And the seller's now agreed in writing on the form to do this, this, and this. Here's the deal with repairs. Any agreed upon repairs have to be in writing and signed by 5 p.m. on our due diligence date. We have to have the seller's agreement in writing and signed while we are still in due diligence. The repairs themselves don't have to be done until prior to settlement. So remember, we have this period of time between due diligence and settlement. As long as the seller agrees in writing to do the repairs, that happens in due diligence. The repairs themselves don't have to be complete until prior to settlement. Or whatever the parties agree to. Could we do something like, in lieu of repairs, let's drop the purchase price? Can the parties agree to that? Everybody shake your head yes. Why? Because the parties can agree to do whatever they want. So maybe the seller offers to pay some closing costs in lieu of repairs. Maybe they drop the purchase price in lieu of repairs. As long as the parties agree, we can do it. Yes, I heard a question.
Julie, yeah, I'm highlighting in my book what you have on the screen,
Good.
but in the book, above the repair improvement where it says sale/lease of existing property, that paragraph isn't there. Is it
So-
possible it's just an older version of the contract?
The highlights on the offer to purchase and contract come from the syllabus. If it's mentioned
Okay.
in the syllabus, then I've highlighted it on our forms.
Okay, so it just may not be in the book necessarily then. Okay, thank you.
Questions on repairs? Let's see, Ben says, but it's confusing to buyer because I have to make an offer and can renegotiate during due diligence. Yes. This is why we have conversations with our buyers up front. You will pay a due diligence fee. Seller may or may not do repairs, right? But the buyer has the choice to proceed with or terminate. This current market that we're in, there was an email that came out to all the brokers in this state from the Real Estate Commission earlier this year, a couple months ago. And what's happening in this crazy market is we said buyers are offering $20,000, $50,000 in due diligence. They're writing a check to the seller for crazy. The biggest one I've heard of so far is $172,000. Again, my question is, did they get that kind of money? But anyway, I digress. So buyers' due diligence are higher, and buyers are thinking, if I'm paying $50,000 in due diligence, you're darn right the seller's going to do a repair. And that's not right, because the amount of due diligence doesn't affect whether or not the seller has to do a repair or not. So the buyer's paying to $50,000 in due diligence. The seller's saying, no, I'm not doing any repairs, because they're $50,000 richer than what they were, right? And they have buyers. How many buyers standing on the front yard with an offer in their hand? If this buyer terminates, they can go under contract again. So sellers aren't doing repairs, but buyers think they should because they're paying all this due diligence. And the Real Estate Commission sent us an email and said, this is on y'all. Y'all are doing a bad job of explaining this to your buyers. We as agents are not doing a good job explaining to the buyers what they're giving up, what they're possibly losing. You guys with me? I'm sorry? I have a question? It doesn't matter if the amount of due diligence is $5 or $50,000. The definitions and the terms of the contract doesn't change. What we need to do with buyers, everybody has a different risk tolerance. I can't make my buyer put down $50,000. All I can do is explain to them what happens, what that risk is, what they're potentially giving up if they do choose to put down that $50,000. You guys with me? I provide the facts. They make the decision. If you want to put down $50,000, that's fine. You're clearly more apt to go to Vegas, drain your savings account, go to Vegas this weekend than what I am, right? Everybody has a different risk tolerance. And if you don't want to lose that $50,000, then maybe you don't put up that $50,000. But we cannot, Ben, and I agree with you. I might be getting a little passionate because it drives me nuts when I hear agents giving their buyers, I'm sorry, flat out wrong information. Oh, just put down 50,000 and the seller will be more than happy to fix, fill in the blank. And the seller is dancing the whole way to the bank going, I got 50,000. You guys with me? So it's our job. And the Real Estate Commission, we got a nasty email, and they're absolutely right, y'all. It's on us to make sure that the buyers understand what their risk is, what they're giving up. Buyers don't like this. which again is why we have consultations up front. We try to prepare them for this. Once they walk in the front door of their dream home, they are not listening to you. Something about due diligence, blah, blah, blah. This is why we try to have these conversations up front. So when they do walk into their dream home, they know how we need to proceed. Other questions or comments? Repairs aren't happening. But again, that pendulum is going to swing back. We will be in a buyer's market again. And all those buyers are going to be laughing. Okay.
Julie,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So in this market, would it maybe be a circumstance where you might see the earnest money be the way to go, to be a little higher versus due diligence, because you have
Anything's negotiable.
more of it, you get the money back, at least if it's within the due diligence
Anything's
period.
negotiable, and it comes down to the buyer's risk tolerance. Some buyers are willing to
Gotcha.
risk more, right?
Gotcha.
To the
Understood.
seller,
Thank you.
50,000 due diligence looks better than 50,000 earnest money, right? To the seller, because 50,000 due diligence goes in their pocket. So how do you have a good offer better than the other 45 on the table, 44 on the table? You got to have something to win to get out on top. It's not easy being a buyer right now. Buyer's obligation to repair damage. If the property gets damaged during the inspection, the appraisal, anything like that, then the expense is on the buyer. I think we mentioned that last week when we were talking about our compensatory damages or consequential damages, consequential damages, buyer's expense to repair the property. And then buyer indemnity, I'll let you read that. But in buyer's right to terminate, provided the buyer has delivered any agreed upon due diligence fee, buyers shall have the right to terminate this contract, here it is again, for any reason or no reason, by delivering to seller written notice of termination during the due diligence period, time being of the essence. If the buyer timely delivers, this contract shall be terminated, and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. So as long as we terminate within due diligence, the seller will almost always keep the due diligence fee. But as long as we terminate within due diligence, the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. All they have to do is provide written notice of termination. They don't even have to tell the seller why they're terminating. All they have to do is provide written notice, and I got a form for that they are terminating. And then this last provision, closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its then existing condition unless provision is otherwise made in writing. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. The home and all its problems are yours. Here are the keys. By this point, the buyer knows what the problems are because they've had their inspections, they've had their investigation, they had the time to learn everything that they possibly could about the home. And by the way, let me just put this out there. There is no such thing as a perfect home. All homes have problems. Even brand new construction has problems. Humans built it. Humans can make mistakes. So there's no such thing as a perfect home. And that's something else we have to coach our buyers on. There's no such thing as a perfect home. Question comes in, how long is a typical due diligence period? It's entirely negotiable. It's entirely negotiable. There's no formula. So it's going to depend. If your buyer's getting a loan, I need more time than if they're cash buyers, right? So there's various factors. Interesting. Interesting. Buyer representations. There are certain representations that the buyer needs to make to the seller, and the seller should be able to rely on the accuracy of these when deciding if they want to enter into a contract with this buyer. So the first thing we need to address is the funds. Is it going to be a cash buyer? If so, show verification of cash, proof of funds letter from the bank, or are you going to get a loan? And if so, what type of loan? So the buyer has to represent the funds, how they're going to purchase the property. The buyer has to represent if they do or do not have other property to sell or lease in order to complete the purchase. This does not create a contingency. This is just the buyer telling the seller, I have to sell another house or I have to lease another home before I can buy yours. So buyer does or does not have to sell or lease. We're told this contract is not conditioned upon the sale or lease. If the parties agree to make this contract condition, an appropriate contingency addendum should be drafted by who? Me and you? No, we can't draft. So if the parties do agree to a contingency, then an attorney, I do not have a form for that. So we have to have an attorney draft that verbiage. The buyer has to represent whether they've received the RPODs and the MOG. Remember, we looked at these back in Unit 8. These were the seller disclosures. The buyer isn't saying they like the way it's completed. They're just saying that they've received them, So they have received a signed copy prior to signing this offer, or they have not received a signed copy. If they have not, then the buyer can terminate if they haven't received them. So they possibly have an out. Same thing with the MOG. They have received a signed copy or they have not. Buyer obligations, here's special assessments again. Buyer's responsible for any special assessments that are confirmed after closing. So special assessments may still be in the proposal stage. They still may be on the table for discussion. And if they haven't been confirmed, if they haven't had the aye vote yet, then after settlement closing, then the buyer will be responsible. We're going to see in just a second that the seller's responsible for those that have been confirmed before settlement. So who pays for what depends on what stage they are in. Buyers obligated to pay for costs in relation to their due diligence, obtaining the loan, home inspection survey, appraisal, whatever else they decide to do to learn about the property. That's the cost for the buyer. And then the seller has representations to make to the buyer. And again, these need to be accurate. These need to be truthful because the buyer should be able to rely on this when deciding if they want to enter into a contract with the seller or not. So the seller has to represent how long they've owned the property. If the property was built prior to, there's our magic year of 1978. Then we have the lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard disclosure addendum that we looked at in Unit 20. If the property's in an HOA, the seller needs to provide the documentation, covenants, bylaws, restrictions, etc. And then the HOA information, how much the dues are, who the HOA is. That's more important, I guess, what the dues are they per month, per year, per quarter, however those dues are paid. Seller's obligations, their biggest obligation is to provide clear marketable title. That's the seller's biggest responsibility, is to provide clear marketable title. Seller has to provide access to the property. So just because we go under contract doesn't mean that the buyer still isn't going to be going in the property. The seller can't deny the buyer's home inspector. They can't deny the buyer's appraiser. They can't deny the people that are assisting the buyer in learning about the property. So they have to provide reasonable access, including for the buyer, the final walkthrough. We need to do the final walkthrough as close to settlement as we possibly can. Because remember what the buyer is signing when they get to settlement. Remember that sentence? They agree to take the property in its current condition. So if they don't know what that current condition is, they don't know what they're agreeing to. So what if, I hear you, what if you do the final walkthrough and the buyer's not satisfied with the condition of the property? Then they don't need to go sign. We need to get on the phone with the listing agent of the seller and say, what's up with this hole in the wall? Or why is this here? Why is that there? Don't have them sign and then think they're going to get it addressed. Because once they sign, they're agreeing to accept the property. As a matter of fact, that's worth me going back for a second. Once they sign, they're accepting of the property in its then existing condition unless provisions are made otherwise in writing. So once they sign, they're agreeing to the property the way it is. So if they're not satisfied, if they don't do the final walk, or if they do the final walkthrough and they don't see, I mean, they see something they don't like. I mean, what if we've never seen the home vacant before? What if the sellers just moved out yesterday? And you go in the day before settlement and you find out there's a reason why there's a picture here, here, and here. And that reason is because they were covering big holes in the wall, right? But we never saw it because the buyer just moved, or the seller just moved out. Basically, your buyer has two choices. We either go to closing or we don't. If we don't, we need to make arrangements. Access to the property also includes seller providing existing utilities at seller's expense. So seller's responsible for keeping utilities on until we get to settlement. Seller has to remove all their personal property, garbage and debris from the property. If they don't and the buyer signs, that garbage and debris becomes the buyer's. So another good reason to do the final walkthrough. Affidavit and indemnification agreement. The seller is pretty much saying that they haven't had any person who has performed or furnished labor, services, materials, or rental equipment within the 120 days prior to settlement. You guys remember talking about the mechanics lien. We want to make sure that if the seller did any repairs, that they paid for those repairs. Because if they did repairs and they didn't pay for them, we go to closing, the mechanic files a lien on the property. So we have the seller sign an affidavit, or the attorney has a seller sign an affidavit. I love this paragraph, bottom of page 9, top of page 10. This pretty much sums up the first 6 units. Execute and deliver a general warranty deed in recordable form. Convey fee simple marketable insurable title without exceptions and mechanics liens, free from other liens, encumbrances, having a current survey, utility easements, all those words we talked about, unit, first couple units. It's what we're building up to. Seller pays to have the deed prepared. Remember CDE, commission, deed preparation fee, and excise tax. So the seller pays to have the deed prepared. We're going to spell out all the names that are going to be on the new deed. So all the buyers' full names and their spouses. Agreement to pay buyer's expense. If the seller is going to pay any seller paid closing costs. If the seller is going to pay anything toward the buyer's expenses. By the way, when it comes to filling out this contract, the general rule of thumb says that we never leave a blank blank. So even if something's not applicable, you put NA for not applicable. But this field especially, of course, in this market, what we're seeing right now is, you know, a big 0, but never leave that blank. Don't leave somebody else the opportunity to slip an amount in there. Negotiated repairs shall be made in good and workmanlike manner, and buyers shall have the right to verify. Provision 9 talks about prorations. We're going to talk all about prorating in Unit 21. So we'll talk about that then. Unit 21 is like our contract to closing process. So we'll see that then. Our risk of loss. If the house burns down while we're under contract, it's still the seller's home. So the risk of loss is going to be on the seller. And one thing we're going to learn in our homeowners insurance unit, Unit 13, is that seller needs to not cancel existing homeowners insurance until that new deed is recorded, because it's still theirs. So seller has got to maintain homeowners insurance. I've had several sellers say that to me. We go under contract and they're like, I'm going to call Geico and cancel. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, no, no. It's still your home. We haven't sold it yet. Delay in settlement. We have a 7-day delay built into our offer to purchase and contract. Everybody, please listen to me. This change was just made last July. So you very well may find some old literature that says 14 days. Anytime you see 14 days, change it to 7. This change was just made last July. The current contract says 7 days. Anytime you see 14. So what this delay in settlement means, as long as both parties are acting in good faith, as long as both parties are working towards closing, towards settlement, one party may be the delaying party, the other party will be the non-delaying party. I think one of the more common examples for a delay is waiting on the loan. We don't have loan approval just yet. If we're waiting on the loan, then the buyer is the delaying party and the seller is the non-delaying party. And what this provision says, that the non-delaying party basically just has to sit still and be patient for 7 days. And hopefully the delaying party can get it together and close within that 7 days. On day 8, the non-delaying party may terminate. And the delaying party would suffer the consequences of breach. But during that 7-day delay, there's nothing that the non-delaying party can do but just sit still and be patient and hope that we can work this out. Can the buyer ask for an extension in settlement? Can the buyer ask for a new settlement date once we're under contract? Sure. Does the seller have to honor that? Do they have to grant that? No. So we can always renegotiate a new date for settlement or closing. But if we don't, we have a 7-day delay. Questions on that? Seven-day. You guys hear me? Anytime you see 14, cross out 7. That just changed last July. Possession, here it is. Including all means of access to the property, such as keys, codes, security codes, garage door openers, electronic devices, etc., shall be delivered when? Upon closing. So when should the buyer get possession? Should they get it at the attorney's office at settlement? No. They should get it upon closing. Contract spells that out for us. Somebody asked earlier, what if the parties agree? I do have a form for a buyer possession before closing or seller possession after closing. So if anybody agrees to take possession when they don't own the property, we have a form for that. Can the parties agree to do this? Sure, the parties can agree to everything. I think buyer possession before closing is pretty common. Maybe you move in the day early or a week early. These forms only allow for short term, like a week or 2 at the most. If you're doing anything longer than 2 weeks, then we need to get an attorney to draw us up a lease. I agree. Is the buyer getting the keys and the garage openers the most exciting part? Y'all know a couple years ago, we bought this house and I got to be our agent. So I wore 2 hats in that transaction. I was the buyer and I was the buyer's agent. And we went to settlement and the paralegal was so cute. I went to check in and I said, you know, we're the Campbells, we're here for closing. And she went, didn't your agent come with you? And I said, I am one of the same. And she went, oh, that's right. I knew that. But she was so concerned that an agent sent buyers to closing with us. I said, no, I got it. So we left the attorney's office, and the attorney gave me the key. We weren't on record, but the attorney gave me the key. He wasn't giving me the key as the buyer. He was giving me the key as the buyer's agent. If you're, as the buyer's agent, receive the key, you need to hang on to it until you know that it's recorded. Don't give that to your buyer until you know it's recorded. So I had the key, and my husband looked at me and said, can we go to the house? And I said, no. He said, why not? We have the key. And I said, because it's not ours until it's recorded. So we went to lunch, we went to Home Depot, because that's what you do when you buy a house, apparently, is go to Home Depot a lot. While we were at Home Depot, we got the email that said we are on record. And that told me two things. I can now pull the key out of my pocket, and I can go back and get my check, my firm's check. We have got to safeguard that. It's in the best interest of both seller and buyer. And yes, I got paid a commission for being the buyer's agent on a home that I bought. That's the best part of that story. It's when I got the commission check. Let's see, we're going to talk about some of these. These are some commonly used addenda. Addenda. We'll talk about these in just a second. Again, just pulling out things. I do want to make sure we all see this. The parties to the contract shall be binding upon and shall, in order to the benefit of the seller and the buyer and their respective heirs. When do heirs kick in? When the parties pass away. So remember, death is only an out when you're negotiating the offer. It's not once you're under contract. Again, I'll let you guys read this. And then on the last page here, we have remedies. Again, this was just added in July. Let me rephrase that. These remedies have always been here, but they pulled them out and gave it its own paragraph in July, so they'd be easier for us to see. So first, we address breach by the buyer. In the event of the breach by the buyer, the seller shall be entitled to earnest money. The payment of the earnest money and the due diligence fee to the seller serves as their liquidated damages. So if the buyer breaches, the seller will keep the due diligence, the seller will get the earnest money. Those are their liquidated damages, and they serve as the seller's sole and exclusive remedy for breach, which means the seller can't sue the buyer. The seller accepts their liquidated damages as their sole and exclusive remedy. Everybody see that? I know we're getting to the end and I'm getting heavy eyes, and I'm so sorry, but this is an important form for us to go over. So if you're struggling staying awake, maybe do some jumping jacks or something. Hokey pokey is always a good thing. Breach by the seller. If material breach by the seller, buyer elects to terminate, buyer shall be entitled to both the earnest money and the due diligence, along with the reasonable costs actually incurred by the buyer in connection with the due diligence period. So there's our compensatory damages. The buyer can sue the seller if they've had the home inspection done, if they've had the appraisal done, the pest inspection, anything related to their due diligence. And remember, in Unit 9.2, we also talked about specific performance. If the seller breaches, not only can the buyer go after them for all the money they spent on this transaction, they can also sue the seller for specific performance, which means if they win, the judge would make the seller sell. They would make the seller perform as they promised. So all those money remedies, all those contract remedies we looked at Unit 9, compensatory damages, consequential damages, liquidated damages, and specific performance are all addressed here in our contract. This paragraph is just saying if one party does have to sue the other, basically the losing party is going to be responsible for both attorney fees and court costs. Because if one party sues the other, the judge is going to pull out the contract and say, I don't understand why we're here. The contract says this is what happens if you breach. So why are we here? And because the contract spells all this out, if one party does take the other to court, the thinking is we're going to make them pay for both because the contract's very clear. Guys, people don't like to terminate. Buyers and sellers, agents, nobody likes to terminate. So if your party's a little stubborn and refuses to sign, give them the night to sleep on it. And tomorrow you say, look, if you don't sign this, you probably will get sued. And if you get sued, this is what it's going to look like. Then we have a place, the official last page of our contract is page 13. So the buyer and seller, all buyers and all sellers sign on page 13. If you have more than 2 buyers or sellers, then we use our additional signatures addendum and get as many signatures on here as what we need to. Here's our wire fraud warning again. We saw this in both of our agency agreements. Bottom line, you guys, wire fraud in real estate has gotten really big, really fast. So we need to do what we can to protect our clients' sensitive information. One of the best ways we can avoid wire fraud is to never, ever, ever email wire transfer instructions. Emails get hacked every day. My Gmail account is about as secure as my closet door. So if I am relaying wire transfer information, it's easy for that email to get hacked. So the best thing we can do to protect our clients is look them in the eyeball and say, I will never email you this information. Because if they get an email that looks like it's from you, they need to know that it's not. So to get wire transfer information, the best thing they can do is go old school, pick up the phone and call the attorney and say, what is your wire transfer information? Have them call a number that they obtained, not one that came in an email. Other things we can do to protect our clients. You can put a 2-step verification on your email. So when I log on to a different device, I have to have the password and then I get a text with a code. That's my 2-step authentication. Y'all stop using password 123 or password 1234 as your password. Y'all know that's not secure, right? You know what hackers try first? Password 123. You know what they try second? Password 1234. So y'all stop using that as your passwords. Careful if you're working out on a public Wi-Fi. Do you know who can access the public Wi-Fi? The public. So if you want to go work in Starbucks, it's best to connect to the mobile hotspot on your phone and not try to get on Starbucks public Wi-Fi. You guys with me? Just take some certain steps to protect your information. But bottom line, never, ever, ever email wire transfer instructions. Billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars have been intercepted from the real estate closing table. And when people are victim of wire fraud, they go after everybody involved, including the real estate agent. Comments or questions on that? We're having all sorts of power issues today. This is interesting. Page 14 is our notice information. So how do we want to communicate with each other? Here's our notice information. So if you choose, you can add the buyer and the seller, but then we also have the agent's information. So remember, the selling firm is the one working with the buyer. The selling agent is on the buyer's side. We also have to identify what our role is. So the selling firm acting as the buyer's agent, the seller sub-agent, or the dual agent. And then if the individual agent is acting as the designated dual agent. And we put in our contact information, including our license number. And then same thing on the listing, acting as the seller's agent or the dual agent. And then if the individual is acting as the designated dual agent. Again, our license numbers are required. Anytime you sign your name as a real estate agent, you need to follow it up with your license number. You'll get a 6-digit number. Go ahead and memorize that. And then the last page is acknowledgement of receipts of money. So basically, anytime money changes hands, we need to acknowledge it. So the buyer, we go into contract, yay, mini celebration. Buyer will get the checks to the buyer's agents. The buyer's agent will deliver the earnest money, and they'll deliver the due diligence to the listing agent. When the listing agent receives it, they acknowledge receipt, and then the listing agent delivers it to the seller, who acknowledges receipt. We need to know that they received it. And then when the escrow agent receives the earnest money, they acknowledge receipt as well. Can we all agree that on its way and in your hand are two totally different things? Don't sign it until you got it. There have been cases at the Real Estate Commission where the due diligence goes missing and the agent went ahead and signed for it. And the commission said, well, where is it? Well, they said they were going to bring it after lunch. Can a lot happen after lunch? You betcha. So please, 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 please don't sign that you've received money until you've actually received it. Question come in. Remember, you guys, the contracts in your book are out of date. So anytime you see a form in your book, always go to Learn, Test, Pass. The contract in your book is 2018. Our current contract is 2021. So what's in your book is what? 3 years old, 4 years old. So always go to Learn, Test, Pass. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your 15-page offer to purchase and contract. It takes us 15 pages for the buyer to promise to buy and the seller to promise to sell. I just summed it up in about 2 sentences, didn't I? This thing continues to grow. I know there are some form changes coming this July. I don't know exactly what yet, but I know there are form changes coming this July. I imagine something will happen in the offer to purchase and contract. The forms committee always does a good job. Once you're licensed, they will do a good job of letting us know. If you're not licensed in July yet, I will always have the current and Learn, Test, Pass. So as long as you're coming to Learn, Test, Pass, as soon as I get my hands on the new form in July, they will be in Learn, Test, Pass. So if you're not ready to take your exam, then keep coming to Learn, Test, Pass to get this information. Everybody good with that? I bought my little condo in 2006. So how many years ago was that? 16 years, something like that. When I bought my condo in 2006, this sucker was 8 pages. See how much we've grown in a very little amount of time? We are not too far away from 16 pages. If it doesn't happen this year, I can almost guarantee it'll happen the next change. We always got to be current and up to date on the forms, those real estate agents. What questions or comments do I have? Standard Form 2T is the most common with resale. I just want to point out, we also have an offer to purchase and contract that we use when you're purchasing vacant lot or land. There's a different form because now we don't have a structure to address, right? We're just dealing with dirt. So we have different terms, different contract. We're not going to go through these. I'll let you look at those if you choose. And then we also have an offer to purchase and contract for new construction. Remember that one sentence in 2T that says this property is being sold in its current condition. Well, if you're doing new construction, you might just be standing on a slab or standing amongst studs, right? So we want to make sure that the builder continues to build, so we have a different contract for that as well. So again, these are just here. In practice, of course, you're always going to want to make sure you're using the correct form. The other thing I have, lots going on in here. Commonly used addenda and amendments. We're getting ready to talk about these. We're not going to go through the forms themselves, but we're going to talk about these, but I do have them in here, no particular order, just for you to peruse. This is actually that email I was telling you guys that we got from the Real Estate Commission that talked about due diligence is the same, whether it's $5 or $50,000. I forgot I put that in here. So I think this is a good email. This is the sign of the times. And then the last thing I have in here is the commission's Q&A brochure on offer and acceptance. It goes into particularly that magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract, what we need to have contract acceptance, etc. So I like the Q&A brochures that the commission offers. They're written for the public, but I think it helps you guys better understand. It gives you another way to help expose yourself to this information and wrap your brains around it. Questions? This is good stuff, isn't it? Okay. Let's take a break. We come back, we're going to get awfully close to wrapping up Unit 10 today. So let's take 10. All right. How are we doing for the last hour? Gonna be able to make it? Do we go do some jumping jacks or something on break? Okay. Run around the block, whatever. Chug coffee. I don't care. Whatever you need to, whatever you need to do. So let's take attendance. I'm not going to quite get the whole way through Unit 10 today, but that's okay. We'll be able to finish up early on Thursday. So when we come back together on Thursday, we'll finish whatever we need to in Unit 10. And then we're going to take just a few minutes and have a conversation about the application process. So you have to submit an application to take your state exam. You have to submit an application for your license. So we'll take some time on Thursday and go through that process. Some of you are more eager and anxious to start than others, and I get that. So we'll talk about that on Thursday. And then we'll have the rest of the class. We're going to start our financing units. So Thursday we'll start 14, and then next week we'll wrap up 14 and 15. So financing, I think I mentioned, tends to be a struggle for some students because it's an entirely different language and vocabulary than real estate. I'm sure when you guys signed up for this class, you didn't know you were getting an introduction to lender world. So we're going to encourage you guys on Thursday to put on your lender's hat. That's the key to get through units in 14 and 15 is to pretend to be a lender. So we'll get that started on Thursday. And thank you for telling me that you're back. If I missed you, please tell me that you're back from break. So now what we need to do is talk about some commonly used addenda. Who can remind me in the chat what an addenda does? One word. What does an addenda do? Look at you guys.
Does she want a written answer?
Babe, you keep talking.
Yeah, do we have a question? So an addenda adds to and becomes part of the offer to purchase and contract. Compare an addenda to an amendment. An addenda adds, an amendment changes. We use an amendment once we've already come to terms. We have a bona fide signed contract in our hand. And for whatever reason, we go into round 2 of negotiations and we decide to change some of our agreed upon terms. That's when we use an amendment. So the forms that we're getting ready to look at add to and become part of the offer to purchase and contract. We have standard addenda that we're going to talk about. Again, the forms themselves are in Learn, Test, Pass. You're welcome to look at them along with your book 293 over to 295. But we're going to go through and just talk about the more commonly used addenda. Please understand this is not all of the addenda that the Forms Committee provides us. These are just the most commonly used. And if you ever have a conflict between an addendum and the contract, the addendum will control, the addendum will prevail. So if there's any conflicting information between the two, the addendum will override the contract. We already looked at the bottom of page 293 over to 294, we already looked at our lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addenda. Remember we talked about that in unit 20. So we've already talked about one addenda. So let's talk about some other commonly used addenda. And the first one we have is FHA VA financing. This is the addenda that we use when your buyer is getting an FHA or a VA loan. If they're getting a conventional loan, do I need to use this form? If they're a cash buyer, do I need to use this form? We only use it when your buyers are getting an FHA or VA financing. We'll talk about FHA and VA financing in units 14 and 15, along with conventional. The big thing about this form It protects the buyer's earnest money if we find out that the home doesn't appraise and they choose to terminate because of that. If we find out after due diligence that the home isn't going to appraise and the buyer chooses to terminate, they'll get their earnest money back. This form protects their earnest money. And also we'll learn when we get into units 14 and 15, the VA, there are certain things that the Department of Veteran Affairs requires VA eligible vets to have done, certain inspections, certain costs. And this form lets the seller know that those costs may be on you. Did you hear what I just said? This form lets the seller know that that cost may be on them. So for example, the VA will require a pest inspection. The VA will not let the buyer pay for the pest inspection. So we need to notify the seller that they're going to be the ones responsible. So that's the gist of our FHA VA financing addendum. We'll talk more about these in units 14 and 15. We saw in our contract that we have two different possession agreements. You have a buyer possession before closing and a seller possession after closing. The things that we need to understand about these forms. One party is acting as the landlord, the owner, whomever owns the property is the landlord. The other party is the tenant. I need two types of insurance. The owner has to have homeowner's insurance. The tenant has to have renter's insurance. We'll agree to terms of rent, how much rent, usually broken down by the day, because this is short term. The suggestion is anything more than 14 days, we have an attorney draft up a lease. These forms are only meant for very short term, and they do address things like who's responsible for rent or pence allowed. Whomever's living there is going to be responsible for utilities and upkeep, maintenance, etc. So a buyer possession before closing, seller possession after closing. As mentioned earlier, we got our lead-based paint hazard addendum. We saw this in unit 20. This applies for residential properties for sale and for rent. Let me see your mouths move. For any property built prior to what year? 1978. The magic year with lead-based paint. Any home that was built prior to 1978, if it's for sale or for rent, we use the lead-based paint hazard addendum. Question came in, do you have to memorize the numbers? No. You just need a very basic understanding of what the forms do. Thank you. Another addendum that we have, and probably the most commonly used one, is called the Additional Provisions Addendum. This form addresses provisions that are, they're common, they're just not common enough to make it into standard offer to purchase and contract. So we use this one quite a bit. Certain things we use this form for. Remember earlier we said the offeror can put an expiration date on their offer. They can say this offer is good until, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, April 20th. If they're going to put an expiration date on their offer, then they can use this form, add it to the offer to purchase and contract, and specify what the expiration date is. If there's a septic tank on the property that needs to be installed, maybe we need to have the land inspected to see if it will support a septic tank. We got a provision for that in the Additional Provisions Addendum. If the property is currently being rented, in North Carolina, you buy honoring the existing lease. So if there's a tenant in place, a lease in place, and you buy with the tenant. And the seller needs to disclose to the buyer, how much rent are we collecting? Is the tenant up to date? Here's the lease. If you buy a home with a lease and a current tenant in place, that's going to be an assignment. Remember what an assignment? You're assigning your duties and obligations to somebody else. With an assignment, the only thing that changes is the name of one of the parties. And in this case, the name that would change would be the landlord. The tenant would stay the same, rent would stay the same, dates, when it's due, all that would stay the same. Everybody with me? It's an assignment. You're assigning your duties and obligations to somebody else. The attorney will help us at settlement. The attorney will help us draft up a new lease. There's a place in the additional provisions addendum for the buyer to ask the seller for any agreed upon repairs and or improvements. Let's talk this through for a second. We add this to the offer to purchase and contract when we're making the offer. In this case, the buyer is asking the seller for repairs, and we don't even have a contract yet. They're asking for repairs before we go as part of the terms of the contract. If your buyer sees something in the home and they say, I am not buying the house like this, then we need to ask the seller to address them when they're considering the terms of all the other terms of the offer. This does not negate, if the contract forms, this does not negate the buyer being able to conduct their due diligence and ask for other repairs once they've had their home inspection done. This doesn't change that. A couple examples of things that you may ask for when you're presenting your offer. What if the carpet smells like wet dog? And the buyer says, I don't want to deal with this. We can ask the seller to replace, repair, whatever the carpet. I had a situation once. There was a nick in the sliding glass door that went out to the back patio. It was probably from a lawnmower. A lawnmower got hold of a little rock and and you could see the nick and you could see it starting to spider. I don't need a home inspector to come in there and tell me that window's broken. Do you? And my buyer looked at that and said, yeah, can they fix that? I said, we can ask for it. Again, we're asking for repairs or improvements at the time we're presenting the offer for the seller to take into consideration. Still have your due diligence, still have your home inspections, still ask for repairs. Sophia, that would count, actually. We'll talk about that. Yep, when we get to our, I think 11 is landlords and tenants. Remember what statute of fraud says about leases. Anything more than how long? 3 years. Statute of frauds has to be in writing, which means you could have a lease less than that, not in writing, right? Another thing addressed in our additional provisions addendum, if there's a manufactured or mobile home on the property that's going to convey, we're going to address that. And then if the pool and spa, the outdoor pool and spa needs to be inspected, who's going to be responsible for, like if it's in the middle of winter, who's going to be responsible? Usually it's going to be on the seller to have that on winterized so the buyer can have their inspection. Additional provisions addendum. Like I said, this is probably the most commonly used one in my experience. And of these, what I see the most is the expiration of offer and the agreed upon repairs and or improvements. I had a post licensing student once, and he said he was down from somewhere around the Fayetteville area. And he said for some reason, sellers in that area, when they go under contract, they don't think they have to mow the lawn anymore. So it could go like 6 weeks without being mowed. And so what he has started doing is putting that in, seller to keep up with lawn care, seller to mow the lawn before closing. with every single one of his offers, because it's that big of a problem in that market, in that area. So the possibilities for that are endless. If it's something that your buyer wants addressed as a consideration of them purchasing this home. Questions on this one? This is a good one. Another commonly used addendum we have is the Owners Association Disclosure and Addendum. There are some times that the RPODs is exempt. One example of when the Residential Property Owners Association Disclosure Statement, also known as the RPODs. One example of when the RPODs is exempt is new construction. So what this form does, part of the RPODs, you'll remember when we looked at it at Unit 8, address the HOA information. Well, if the RPO is not required, this form still gets that information to the buyer, the HOA information to the buyer. So we use this when the RPOs is exempt. Where are my beach and mountain people? You may at some point deal with vacation rentals. Winston-Salem is lovely, but let's face it, we don't deal much with vacation properties here. So that's why I say more if you're down at the beach or up in the mountains. And if you're dealing with a property that is a vacation rental, then you have the vacation rental addendum. And you'll learn much more about the Vacation Rental Act when you affiliate with your firm. But we have an addendum. If the property is being sold as a vacation property, we have a short sale addendum. Now we're going to talk all about short sales in unit 14 or 15, one of our financing units. So we may actually look at this form when we get there, just depending on how we're doing on time. But with a short sale, the gist of it, the owner owes more than the property is worth. They're underwater. So the short sale addendum creates a contingency. And what this contingency says is, I can't sell my home if I don't get approval from the lien holders. Basically, what they're asking the lien holders to do is to release their interest with less than what they're owed. So if we can't get the lien holders' approval, then the seller can't convey clear marketable title. We'll talk a lot more about this in unit 14 and 15. And then we have the backup contract addendum. This is the one that we're going to use if we're already under contract and a backup offer comes in. So we're under contract, congratulations. Another buyer comes in and makes an offer as the backup buyer in the hopes of being placed in a secondary position. And it's really funny to think about this, but basically what's happening, the backup buyer is hanging out, fingers crossed, that the primary buyer will terminate. Because if the primary buyer terminates for any reason, the backup buyer's in. The seller doesn't have to put their home back on the market. They don't have to go through showings and 45 offers and all that other stuff again. The way this form works, the backup buyer presents their offer to the seller. Buyer and seller negotiate as they always would. And when they come to agreed upon terms, this backup buyer is in that backup position. Again, if the primary terminates for any reason, the backup buyer is the primary. The backup buyer doesn't owe due diligence until and if they ever become the primary. The backup buyer will put down earnest money. But if they terminate at any time prior to being primary, they'll get their earnest money back. Remember, earnest money is just showing good faith. So they will put up earnest money. If they never become the primary, they'll get their earnest money back. As you can imagine, we're seeing this form more and more because of the multiple offer world that we're living in. 45 offers, right? Only one can get accepted. The other 44 are going, what do I do? They may be able to do a backup. Please understand, this form only allows for one backup buyer. We can't have a backup to the backup to the backup to the backup. So it only allows for one backup buyer. And if the primary terminates for any reason, the backup moves up to the primary position. Sometimes sellers like this, again, it's a hassle in this market to put your home for sale and allow showings. I mean, you're pretty much kicked out of your home for, a couple days, however long you allow showings. Think about from the sellers. I mean, guys, 45 offers. We just looked at an offer to purchase and contract that's 15 pages. So 45 offers times 15 is 675 pages for the seller to sort through. Is that a little intimidating to the seller? I mean, you guys just met the 15-page offer to purchase and contract. Was that a little intimidating? Sure, it's okay. I get it. Yeah, it's a little intimidating. Could you imagine getting 675 pages of that? So some sellers are like, golly, I don't want to go through this again. Yes, I will take a backup. It's all negotiable. We have to agree on all the terms.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So basically, this is the option. Is it whenever, the actual contracts, would this be in there or just have to be by request?
Well, you're going to use it when you're already under contract. So if your buyer wants to make an offer on a property that's already under contract, you have to use this. We have to acknowledge that they want to go into a backup position. And how many backup buyers are we allowed to have? Just one. Just one. We can't line them down the road. If the backup moves into a primary, then you can call the other buyer that want to be able to, okay, now the backup position is open, right? You could keep that going, but you can only have one primary and one backup. There are other forms. Again, we're not spending time in this class looking at these, but I do have a form for a repair request. So if the seller agrees to do any repairs, I have a form for that. We have a form for negotiations. We can negotiate via text or email, but we can also use something called the response to buyer's offer. Response to buyer's offer to negotiation. Then we have a whole slew of termination forms. Termination with release of earnest money, termination without release of earnest money, buyer terminate, seller terminate. I don't know, there's probably like 6 dang termination forms. I'll let you guys look at those when you affiliate with your firm. That's not pre-licensing material. There's an old joke. The commission jokes about it. It's so funny. I used to always joke about it too. Back in my admin days, an agent would come into my office. Is there a form for that? Yes. Well, you didn't even hear what I was going to say. But I promise you, whatever you're getting ready to say, more than likely, there's a form for that. And in the small chance that there's not a form for that, then we have an attorney draft something else. So North Carolina Association of Realtors provides us with these standard forms, standard addenda, agency agreements, everything that we've discussed and more. Once you affiliate with your firm, you'll have access to the forms. And if you don't have a form for that, then we have an attorney draft something up. Questions? Okay. Flipping over to page 296, we talk about submitting offers to sellers, presenting offers to sellers. Listing agents or buyer's agents communicating with a FSBO. We have to deliver all offers to sellers immediately, but in no event later than 3 days. When do we deliver offers to sellers? Immediately. Don't hang on to offers. We also need to understand that we present what offers to sellers? Every single one of them. Can I make a decision for my seller? Absolutely not. But what if, I hear you, what if it's a lowball offer that's going to insult my seller and make them mad? What offers do I present to my sellers? All of them. You don't know when your seller situation might have changed. For example, I had a seller once, never met the man. We did everything electronically. He lived up in Maryland. To this day, I've never met the man. Isn't that something? He could walk in my front door right now and I'd have no clue who he is. He told me when I listed his house, if I can't sell for X amount, then I can't afford to sell. Okay, fair enough. I'm pretty sure I can get you that. I had an offer come in that was less than X amount. He had already told me that he couldn't afford to sell. What do you think I did when I got that offer for less than X amount? Did I reject it on his behalf? Absolutely not. I called him and I said, hey man, how's it going? We got an offer. This is what they want. He said, Julie, I can't do it. I said, great. Have a nice day. I'll talk to you later. You guys with me? What if something happened to his financial situation last night and he had to sell no matter what? And then he found out I rejected an offer on his behalf. Woo. So even if they say, present all offers, even if they say, don't show me those that are less than X amount. Seller, understand my license law and commission rule says that I have to present all offers. It's a 30-second phone conversation. 3 days are calendar days. A day is a day. Saturday and Sunday count. Yep. And please, that's a good point. Thank you for letting me go back. Note that this says, yeah, never mind. I'm talking about something else. Never mind. Never mind. I got excited, got ahead of myself. So a day is a day. 3 days a broker's receipt. Do you guys like to take vacation sometimes? Do you like to go away? I mean, y'all, the president of the United States of America gets to take a vacation, then I think real estate agents should as well. It's not a bad idea to make friends in your firm, because when you go to the beach for a week, real estate keeps happening. And if you're not going to be available to communicate and receive and accept and communicate with your sellers, then you need to have somebody help you out. Don't look at your seller and say, we're going to take a week off because I'm going to the beach. Your seller's not going to like that. So if you need to go, and I say get away. The most liberating thing I ever did, we took a cruise a couple years ago. My husband said, do you want the Wi-Fi pack or the drink pack? I said, oh, drink package for sure. He said, no Wi-Fi pack. I went a whole 5 days without my phone. It was nice. But you know what? I made sure I had coverage here before I went. Take a vacation, take a day off. It's okay, but you just got to have backup. You got to have somebody helping you out. So make friends in your office. You scratch their back, they'll scratch yours. Again, please understand when we're talking about sellers, this is the listing agent communicating with their seller. This is also the buyer's agent communicating with the for sale by owner. Remember, for sale by owner doesn't have representation. So you, the buyer's agent, could be communicating directly with the seller. Any questions on this. What about if we know that we have an offer coming? Do we need to let our sellers know? What if the showing agent, they go and see the property this afternoon and they say, this was great. We're going to go home and draft up an offer, write up an offer. Should you let your sellers know that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Once we know is something coming, we need to keep them in communication throughout the whole time. Question comes in, if somebody helps you, do you have to pay them? Maybe you pay them. Maybe you say, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Help me out when I go to the beach this week. I'll hook you up next month. You with me? Help each other out. And remember what we said earlier, you guys. Even if you know you have offers coming, the seller is free to accept any offer at any time. Even if something's coming, they don't have to wait for it. The seller's free to accept any offer at any time. Other questions? Submitting offers to sellers? For some reason, this was a common complaint at the commission last year. Sellers were saying they weren't getting offers right away, and I don't understand that. If you're a listing agent and you get an offer, what are you waiting for? That's why I'm pausing, because I want to make sure we're good here. Then we address multiple offers, which is really interesting. We've always talked about multiple offers, but now they're truer today than what they've ever been. When we handle multiple offers, first off, it's very important that we understand that multiple offers are not a material fact. We don't have to disclose that there are multiple offers. The seller chooses if we disclose. Buyers respond one of two ways when they find out there's multiple offers. The buyer will either up their game and bring a better offer, or the buyer will run away. So sellers need to decide if they want to disclose if we have multiple offers. And if your seller says, no, don't tell anybody we have multiple offers, and another agent calls you and says, do you have multiple offers? Am I allowed to lie to them? Am I allowed to lie? I wish I saw more head shaking. No. Am I allowed to lie ever? No. So when I have multiple offers and the other agent calls me and says, do you have multiple offers? My response is my seller doesn't want to disclose that. Is that a lie? No. But don't say no when you do. When it comes to multiple offers, we need to deliver everything that we have in our hand in no particular order. I cannot favor one offer over the other. When I am delivering offers to my sellers, I deliver everything that I have in my hand in no particular order. What about the highest price offer? What about the offer coming from another agent in my firm? Better yet, what about the offer coming from a buyer that I'm working with? Can I favor one offer over the other? No. But Julie, I would get more money if I was a dual agent. Doesn't matter, you guys. We present all offers at the same time in no particular order. We cannot favor. One thing that's come out of this crazy world we're living in, and I like this so much, we still have to present all the offers, right? Which means we need to put them in an email attachment. We still need to provide that information. But one thing that agents are doing in this multiple offer world we're living in is creating an Excel spreadsheet and saying, like, here are the terms of offer one, purchase price, due diligence, earnest money. Here are the terms of offer two. Here are the terms of offer three. And they're doing a very nice side-by-side comparison. As a seller, would you rather have an Excel spreadsheet pulling out the highlights? or 675 pages and being told to sort through them and let me know if you have any questions. So I think for the seller, putting them in some kind of organized format, organized Excel sheet or something, it's a lot less intimidating. I mean, my agent that got 45 offers, by the way, she's our team leader and she's been at it for 30 some years. She got overwhelmed and intimidated by it, right? 45 offers. So whatever we can do to help alleviate that for our sellers, that's just an example, of course. Also, with multiple offers, we can't shop offers. We can't pit buyers against each other. There's a rule, a license law and commission rule that we'll get to when we get to our license law and commission rule section. This says I cannot disclose the terms of an offer without the offeror's permission. Who is the offeror? The offeror is not, y'all don't say buyer. The offeror is the giver of the offer. And I cannot disclose the terms of the offerors of the offer without the offeror's permission. Do you think any offeror in their right mind is going to give you permission to disclose the terms? Yeah, tell them what I offered so they have a chance to beat that. You guys with me? So we can't pit buyers together. What we say is you bring me your best offer by 5 p.m. on April 19th. There's no negotiations going on right now. Buyers are bringing their best offer by the deadline. Question came in, if you get multiple offers, can the seller say, just show me the ones above our asking price? I mean, they can say that, but what offers do I have to present to them? So they can say that, but I still have a duty to present all of them. And I can pick out my favorites. You know, I can help them, of course. Y'all please don't think I can't help them, because I can. That's why they hired me. But I can't tell them which one to accept, right? I help them identify the terms, which one looks best. It's a lot more than just the purchase price. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. Questions or comments? Multiple offers? A question comes in with the backup contract. At what point does it become a legally binding contract? The terms are negotiated as always. So once the last offeree accepts and then communication of acceptance crosses the line, then we have a binding contract with a backup contract addendum. And I got to say, what? What? Is that a question, Sotessa?
I'm sorry, I actually had wrote it to somebody else, so I guess I'll say it out loud. I was asking you just like that, if in a situation or you are getting multiple offers and you know, it's the privacy thing you was talking about where you can't, can you hear me? Because I know sometimes my volume is tripping. And you was like that you can't disclose about if you have multiple listings and the listing agent is asking about it, and you say no. Are you jeopardizing your license because you're lying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Misrepresentation? Absolutely. Y'all write that down if you need to. Don't lie. That's just good advice, isn't it? Today's class was brought to you by the letter. We can't lie. We can't cheat. We can't steal. They take all the fun out of it for us, don't they? Let's see. Handling modifications and counter offers. Remember what we said, any change to an offer rejects the original offer, becomes a counter offer. If you're making these changes in these counters on the form itself, and you keep going back and forth. Anytime you make a change, you have to initial and date. All parties have to initial and date the change. So once you do that a couple times, it gets hard to read. I don't know if you guys noticed on our offer the purchase and contract, but I don't have a lot of room to write in other spaces, right? And that's designed that way for a reason. They don't want to give me a lot of space to write when I can't. But if you do make numerous of changes, once you come to an agreement, do up a new offer, do up a new contract, nice, neat, clean for everybody to sign. But keep the old one, because that shows the meeting of the minds. That shows the counter offers and the negotiations. And what do we document? Everything. So that listing my team had a couple weekends ago with 45 offers. Yeah, we kept the one that became a contract, but we also had to keep those other 44 offers. So if you're in a multiple offer situation, or if you have an offer that never becomes a contract, we have got to retain, because we document everything. Look at your tattoo, document everything. So keep it all. The response to buyer's offer, we talked about that on page earlier. That response to buyer's offer is on page 297. Again, that's just it's a letter from the seller to the buyer responding to their offer. It's not an acceptance, it's not a counter offer. So that's where that at 297 in your book addresses that. Furnishing copies. I don't want to say copies anymore because we're not dealing with copies. We're mostly dealing with electronics, but you may still get a chance to touch paper. I don't necessarily need to have, so many originals, as long as everybody gets access to a copies. So let's talk about who needs a copy of the executed contract. Of course, buyer and seller deserve a copy. Both agents, listing agent and selling agent, need a copy. The lender, if there's a lender involved, they will need a copy of the contract. Again, we'll talk about that lender's process. The closing attorney needs a copy of the contract. So once we go under contract, do your mini celebrate. I'm all about celebrating the small wins. So when you get an accepted contract, do a little mini celebration. Don't run out and spend your money yet, though, because you still haven't gotten paid, right? So just do a little mini celebration. Yay, we're under contract. Both agents will get a copy to their client, buyer and seller. Buyer's agent, immediately send a copy of that contract to the lender. The loan process is, without a doubt, the longest part of the contract to closing process. That's what takes us the longest, is getting that loan approval. So as soon as you have an executed contract in your hand, get it to the lender so they can start their part. Again, we'll talk more about that starting on Thursday, units 14 and 15. The closing attorney is the next one. So once you send the contract to the lender, immediately go ahead and get it to the attorney. Get that closing or settlement, I should say, scheduled. They're going to want to do like their preliminary title search, start doing their thing, but we want to get the date on the books. And goodness, e-programs have helped us out so much, because now you can share, you don't need paper unless you have buyers or sellers request it. I need everybody to understand that not everybody has an email address. Look at some of you, what? Yeah, seriously, not everybody has an email address. So you may have to make exceptions. Remember, you guys, the buyer and the seller, they're the boss. So if they say, I don't want to deal with email, I want to deal with paper copy. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. You guys with me? They are the boss. I had sellers once, they were the cutest couple, probably early to mid 80s. They were selling their townhome to move down to the beach with the grandkids. They didn't say anything about their children. They just said the grandkids. So they were selling the townhome to move. And I was over there in my listing consultation. And I got to the point of doing documents and I said, do you guys have an email address? And he said, I think I do, but it's been a long time since I used it. What should we do? I said, stop. I will drive everything to you. Because at that point, I realized I had a choice. I either set them up and teach them how to use email, or I go old school and print stuff off and drive it over there. That's the grandkids' job, is to teach them how to use email, right? Not Julie's. So please just keep that in mind, that not everybody is in this e-world. Not everybody's on board with that. Questions, comments? So we're going to go through a little exercise together, and I want you guys to do your heads, yes or no. And we're going to go through a scenario about when does it go from being an offer to a contract. Okay, everybody with me? You ready to do your head one way or the other? Yeah, okay. So buyer offers a purchase price of $150,000 with $250 in due diligence, $250 in earnest money, $1,500 in closing costs, and a closing date in 3 months. They ask for the home warranty, and of course, they want the refrigerator. At this point in time, are we under contract? And I'm seeing heads shake no, and you're right. Buyer makes an offer. What's that mean? Absolutely nothing. Seller now has 3 choices, don't they? They can accept it, reject it, or counter it. In this case, the seller counters. They say, we're not paying closing costs. You are not getting my refrigerator. And we want to close in 6 weeks. All other terms are acceptable. So hang on, let's talk about what that means. That means we're good with the purchase price. We're good with the due diligence, and we're good with the earnest money. So we're saying with good with all these terms, but closing costs, refrigerator, in 6 weeks to closing. The seller has now presented a new offer to the buyer. This purchase price, this due diligence, this earnest money, but these new terms. At this point in time, are we under contract? No, you guys are good. So the seller's countered. The buyer now has 3 choices, don't they? The buyer can accept it, reject it, or counter it. Everybody with me? Walking through. So the seller's made their counter. The buyer says, okay, I accept the terms of the counter, and they tell their agent to go for it. By accepting, we know that that means what? If they've accepted in pre-licensing world, then they have signed. Are we under contract? Yes or no? Woo, we're starting to divide a little bit here, aren't we? I got some yeses and some nos. Buyer accepts the terms of the seller's counter and tells their agent to go for it. Am I under contract? No. Why? We still have to have communication cross the line. When the buyer calls their agent, remember their agent is staying on the same side of the line. So now the selling agent calls the listing agent and says, you've got yourself a deal. Are we under contract at that point? Yes. See how this works? We keep going back and forth until we have acceptance, and then communication of acceptance has to cross the line. What questions do I have on that? All right, you guys got your private chat ready? Take just a few minutes and read this question. Tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. Give you just a few more seconds to weigh in. I love the question marks, by the way. All right, so let's see what we got here. Only one right answer. Question marks don't count and or it doesn't count. Okay, so let's see what we got here. On Sunday, a listing agent receives a written offer for $145,000 for a house listed at $154,900. Not in this market. On Monday, the seller counters at $149,900 and gives the buyers 3 days to accept. A counter offer is what? A counter offer is a rejection. So on Monday, the seller rejected the buyer's offer that they got on Sunday. Everybody with me? On Wednesday, the buyers reject the counter, and upon being informed, the seller says, no, I'll accept the buyer's original offer. Under these conditions, there is nothing, because once you counter it, there is no going back. A counter is a rejection. Could the seller have woke up on Wednesday and made a brand new offer to the buyer with these terms? Yes, but it's a new offer. You can't go back. Once it's countered, it's dead, and there is no going back. Questions on this? Okay. All right. Don't go anywhere. We are going to get a few minutes early today because I'm not starting something new just to go for 3 minutes. That's not cool. So let's talk about what Thursday looks like. We're going to finish up Unit 10. The rest of Unit 10 is all green stars. So can we all agree we can get through the rest of Unit 10 on Thursday pretty quickly? You need basic level 1 understanding. So is everybody good with that? So we're going to get through the rest of Unit 10 pretty quickly on Thursday. We're going to Kahoot on Thursday. We get to Kahoot. We are going to talk about your application process, how you apply to take your state exam, and what that looks like for you guys. So we'll look at that. And then we're going to get started on Unit 14. I cannot stress this enough. Students struggle with Units 14 and 15 because it's a new language. It's a new vocabulary. You didn't know you were signing up for this. And yes, with financing comes math. So look ahead, look at the math. We'll get started on 14. We probably won't get through it, so we'll have that to look forward to the next week. I think that's all I have to say. I think I'm good. So y'all have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Y'all have a good rest of your day. Have a good day tomorrow. Go get some sunshine. We see sun today, so that's always exciting. And I will see everybody at 9 a.m. on Thursday morning.